Gaslighting is when someone makes you question what you saw, heard, or remember. It's not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it slips into a conversation so smoothly that you don't notice what's happening until much later. The goal of gaslighting is control. It doesn't look like control right away. It looks like someone saying, "That's not what happened," or "You're remembering wrong." But over time, it makes you unsure of yourself. That's the point. It often starts with small things. Maybe you bring up something that upset you. You say, "You raised your voice at me yesterday. It made me uncomfortable." And the other person says, "That never happened. You're being too sensitive." If this happened once, maybe you'd let it go. But when it keeps happening, it chips away at your confidence. You begin to wonder, did I get it wrong? Was it really not a big deal? Did I imagine it? Gaslighting works by making you rely on someone else's version of reality instead of your own. You might think you're just trying to keep the peace. You stop bringing things up. You second guess yourself before you speak. You start to believe you're the problem, not the situation. Here's a basic scenario. Say you live with someone, a partner, a roommate, maybe even a parent. You notice the thermostat keeps changing. You like it cool, and they know this. You ask, "Hey, did you turn up the heat again?" They answer, "No, I haven't touched it. You must have done it by accident." You're pretty sure you didn't, but you let it go. The next day, it happens again. You ask again, same answer. They say, "You always do this. You forget things and then blame me." Over time, you stop trusting your memory. Maybe you even start writing things down, just to make sure. You're not crazy, but you feel like you might be. That feeling, like you can't trust yourself, is a major sign of gaslighting. It's not just about lying, it's about creating doubt. The person gaslighting you doesn't need you to believe every lie. They just need you to believe that your version of events might be flawed. That's enough to get you to back down, stay quiet, or feel guilty. Gaslighting doesn't only happen in romantic relationships. It can happen at work. Imagine a manager gives you instructions. You follow them exactly. Later, they say, "That's not what I told you to do." You check your notes, you're sure you did it right, but they insist you got it wrong. They don't yell. They're calm. Maybe they even smile. You must have misunderstood. You start to feel unsure. Next time they give you a task, you hesitate. You ask more questions, you apologize more. And when you slip up, even if it's small, it confirms their story. You're unreliable. In families, gaslighting can stretch over years. A parent might say, "You were such a difficult child," even though you remember being quiet, always trying to please them. When you bring up painful memories, they might say, "You've always been dramatic," or "That never happened." Maybe you recall a family argument clearly, who said what, how it ended, but they shut it down. You're making things up again. Eventually, you stop trusting your own memory. You might even tell stories with phrases like, "I think it happened this way, but I could be wrong." That hesitation isn't just politeness. It's doubt that got planted and fed over time. Gaslighting thrives in situations where the other person has some kind of power. That power doesn't have to be official. It can be emotional. If someone knows you look up to them, depend on them, or want to please them, they have power. That power gives them room to rewrite events. They might say they're helping you. "I'm just telling you the truth." Or, "You need to hear this." That's part of the confusion. It sounds reasonable, but the intent isn't clarity, it's control. When someone tells you over and over that your memory is wrong, your reactions are too much, or your feelings aren't valid, they're not giving you the truth. They're giving you their version and insisting it's the only one that counts. Sometimes gaslighting comes with kindness. That's what makes it harder to spot. They apologize, but only in ways that make you feel worse. "I'm sorry you feel that way," not "I'm sorry I did that." There's no ownership. You end up doing the work. You soothe them. You backpedal. You question yourself. You might start to hide things, to keep a journal, to record conversations, to run stories by other people. "Does this sound weird to you?" becomes a regular question. You want a second opinion because you've stopped trusting your first one. When gaslighting becomes a pattern, it rewires how you think. You don't just doubt your memory, you doubt your instincts. You might feel hurt, but convince yourself you're overreacting. You might feel disrespected, but tell yourself it wasn't intentional. You explain away everything until you don't know what's real anymore. This doubt isn't weakness. It's the result of someone pushing you there, step by step. They want that doubt in place. If you're always questioning yourself, you're less likely to question them. You might also notice you've stopped bringing things up. When something feels off, you let it go. You don't want to deal with the pushback. You don't want to be told you're wrong again. So you choose silence. That silence is heavy. It builds up. It changes how you move through the world. Gaslighting can isolate you. If someone keeps telling you your experiences aren't real, it makes it harder to connect with others. You might feel embarrassed to talk about it. You might worry people won't believe you. That fear keeps you quiet, which makes the gaslighting even stronger. Because now, it's not just between you and them, it's in your own head. You start gaslighting yourself. You say, maybe I misunderstood. Maybe it wasn't a big deal. Maybe I'm too sensitive. You repeat the same phrases they use. Their words become your thoughts. That's when it really sinks in. Recognizing gaslighting takes time. It takes a quiet kind of honesty. You don't have to be sure of every detail. You just need to pay attention to the pattern. Do you leave conversations feeling confused? Do you often feel like you have to apologize even when you're not sure why? Do you second-guess things that felt clear a moment ago? These are the signals. Not loud, not dramatic. Just steady pressure that makes you doubt yourself more and more. Someone who gaslights doesn't need to scream. They don't need to call you names. They just need you to stop trusting yourself. Once that happens, they're in control. And that's what gaslighting is really about. Not arguments, not misunderstandings, not different points of view. It's about taking your confidence, your clarity, and replacing it with confusion. Quiet, daily confusion, until you forget what it felt like to believe your own mind. Guilt tripping is when someone uses guilt to get you to do what they want. It doesn't always sound mean. It can sound caring, quiet, even thoughtful. But the goal is control. The person wants you to feel bad enough that you give in. They might not say it outright, but the message is clear. If you don't do what they want, you're selfish, ungrateful, or disappointing. It often shows up in relationships. A parent says, "After everything I've done for you, you can't even call me once a week." They don't ask how you're doing or why you've been quiet. They go straight to guilt. The real message is, you owe me. Not love, not time, but a repayment for their past efforts. You feel heavy after a comment like that. Maybe you call them out of guilt. Maybe you visit when you're too tired. You don't do it because you want to. You do it to stop the guilt. That's how guilt tripping works. It pushes you toward a decision, not with logic or kindness, but with pressure. You feel like you're failing someone, even when you're not. It can sound like a complaint, but it's not just venting. A friend says, "I guess I'll go alone like I always do." You didn't say no yet. You didn't even say you were busy. But now, if you don't go, you feel like you're letting them down. If this only happened once, you might brush it off. But if it keeps happening, it builds a pattern. You become the one who gives in. Not because you agree, but because it's easier than dealing with the guilt. Sometimes the guilt is tied to your values. If you care about being kind, someone might say, "I just didn't expect you to be so cold." If you care about loyalty, they might say, "I'd never do that to you." The guilt lands harder because it hits something you care about. That's what makes guilt tripping effective. It doesn't just ask for a favor. It questions your character. You start to notice that certain people only reach out when they want something. And if you say no, they don't accept it. They respond with silence or sighs or stories meant to make you feel bad. A sibling says, "It's fine, I'll just figure it out myself like always." You didn't agree to help, and now it feels like you failed them. Not because of what you did, but because of how they framed it. This kind of control doesn't look loud. It doesn't come with yelling or demands. It often looks quiet. It might come through long pauses, short texts, or passive comments. You ask, "Are you okay?" And they say, "I will be." They want you to guess what you did wrong. They want you to try harder, offer more, feel worse. You end up doing things not because they asked, but because they made you feel like you had to. At work, guilt tripping can show up when someone says, "I thought you were a team player," just because you set a boundary. Maybe you said you couldn't stay late. Maybe you asked to split a task. Now, instead of addressing the issue, they question your loyalty. You didn't break a rule. You didn't cause a problem, but the guilt puts you on the defensive. You explain, apologize, even backtrack. That's how it works. It moves the focus away from fairness and toward emotion. Romantic partners can use guilt tripping to keep control without looking controlling. One partner says, "It's okay, I guess I just care more than you do." They frame your boundary as a lack of love. Maybe you needed space, maybe you didn't agree with them. Now you're left defending your feelings instead of discussing the issue. You feel pulled to prove you care, even if it means giving up what you need. Guilt tripping can also be disguised as concern. A partner might say, "I just worry about you when you go out like that." It sounds protective, but maybe it's not about safety. Maybe it's about where you go, who you see, or how long you're away. The concern is a cover. The guilt makes you question yourself. You start staying home more, not because you want to, but because it keeps the peace. In families, guilt often hides under the idea of duty. A parent might say, "You're all I have," or "I guess I don't matter anymore." These aren't requests. They're statements meant to pull you in. You feel like you're abandoning them if you say no. You feel like a bad person for having your own life. The guilt keeps you close, not out of love, but out of pressure. You might notice the same script repeating. You say you're busy, and the other person brings up everything they've done for you. You set a boundary, and they say you've changed. You take time for yourself, and they act hurt. The more you stand up for yourself, the more guilt they send your way. It becomes predictable. You brace for it. You start softening your words, padding your no with long explanations. You try to manage their feelings before you even speak. That's a sign of how deep guilt tripping can go. It doesn't just shape your actions, it shapes how you think. You don't ask what's fair or reasonable, you ask what will cause the least guilt. You might even guilt trip yourself. You say, "They've been through a lot," or "they mean well." You look for reasons to excuse their behavior, because the alternative means recognizing that someone is using guilt to control you. Guilt tripping isn't always planned. Some people do it because they were raised with it. They saw it work. They learned that guilt gets results. That doesn't make it okay, but it helps explain why it's so common. It's not always a grand scheme. Sometimes it's just a habit that turns into a pattern. But the impact is the same. It makes you act out of pressure, not choice. When you're caught in a guilt-tripping cycle, you stop asking what you want. You focus on how to avoid the guilt. You agree to things that drain you. You take responsibility for feelings that aren't yours. You might feel tired all the time, or irritated, or low, but you keep showing up because not showing up feels worse. The guilt sits heavy. It clouds everything. You might start to resent the people you care about, not because you don't love them, but because it never feels like enough. You give, they ask for more. You explain, they ignore it. You set a line, they step over it. Over time, you feel smaller, not physically, but in how much space you're allowed to take. You're always making room for their disappointment, always carrying the weight of their unspoken expectations. That's what guilt tripping does. It shifts the burden onto you. It doesn't ask for help, it demands it, then calls it love. It doesn't allow for your limits. It pushes you to go past them, then thanks you in a way that makes you feel like you had no choice. The more it happens, the more you forget what it feels like to make decisions without pressure. You say yes before you think. You feel bad before you speak. And somewhere along the way, your wants stop mattering. Not because they don't exist, but because they've been buried under someone else's guilt. Love bombing is when someone overwhelms you with affection, compliments, and attention early on to create a fast emotional bond. It feels intense. It feels special. But it's not about love. It's about control. The person wants to win you over quickly so they can start shaping the relationship to fit their needs. They don't want to grow trust over time. They want you hooked before you even know what's happening. It often starts fast. You meet someone, and right away they're saying things like, "I've never felt this way before," or "You're everything I've ever wanted." They text all day. They want to see you every night. They buy gifts, plan trips, talk about the future after only a few days. At first, it feels flattering. Most people want to feel wanted. If you've been through bad relationships, this kind of attention might feel like a dream. but the speed is part of the tactic. It doesn't give you time to think. You're caught in the excitement before you have a chance to ask what's real. In a healthy relationship, things build over time. You get to know each other slowly. You learn how the other person reacts to stress, conflict, boredom. Love bombing skips that process. The focus stays on the high. There's no space to breathe, no space to ask, do I feel comfortable, or is this moving too fast for me? The person doing the love bombing often keeps the pressure on. They'll say things like, I just know we're meant to be, or we're soulmates. They may talk about moving in together, getting married, or starting a family, even if you've only been seeing each other for a few weeks. If you raise concerns, they act hurt. I thought you felt the same way. Or they frame it as a compliment. I can't help how much I love you. But the real message is clear. You're expected to keep up with their pace, or else you're the problem. Sometimes love bombing includes public gestures, big posts online, expensive gifts, over-the-top surprises. These aren't always about you. They're often about how they want to be seen. It's part of the performance. They want you and everyone else to believe the relationship is perfect. That makes it harder for you to speak up when something feels off. If everyone thinks you've found the perfect partner, you might start to believe it too, even when the cracks start showing. And the cracks do show, because love bombing isn't about sustaining love. It's about gaining power. Once you're emotionally invested, the behavior often changes. The constant attention turns into control. They might say you're spending too much time with friends. They might criticize how you dress or question who you text. It starts small. I just miss you. I worry about you when you go out. But soon, you're adjusting your life around their moods and opinions. If you push back, they may withdraw affection. The messages slow down. The warmth disappears. You go from being everything to nothing. That shift is confusing. It makes you question yourself. Did I do something wrong? Did I change? But what really happened is that the love bombing did its job. It pulled you in so fast and deep that you now feel desperate to get back to how things were. You try harder, explain more, apologize even when you're not sure what you did. That's the control. It's not just about giving love, it's about making you chase it. People who use love bombing tend to rely on emotional highs and lows. When things are good, they're amazing. You feel close, connected, wanted. When things are bad, they're cold, distant, or angry. The contrast keeps you off balance. You start to crave the good moments, not because the relationship is healthy, but because the lows feel so painful. You may even feel like you're addicted to the relationship. That's not love. That's a cycle of emotional dependency. It's also hard to explain to others. From the outside, the relationship might look great. They see the gifts, the affection, the big statements. They don't see the pressure behind it. They don't hear the private comments that make you feel small. If you try to bring it up, people might say they just love you a lot. Or you're lucky to have someone who cares so much. That makes it harder to trust your gut. You start wondering if you're overthinking it. Love bombing doesn't always look like manipulation at first. It looks like connection. It sounds like someone who's finally honest about their feelings. But the test comes when you set a boundary. You say, I need space, or this is moving fast. If the reaction is guilt, silence, or anger, that's a sign. In a healthy connection, someone will respect your pace. They'll slow down if you ask. With love bombing, slowing down threatens the whole plan. If you take away the speed, the control slips. Sometimes the person love bombing you will switch roles and act like the victim. If you try to pull back, they say things like, everyone leaves me, or you're just like the others. They paint themselves as hurt, abandoned, misunderstood. Now, you're not just defending your boundaries, you're managing their emotions. You stay, not because you're happy, but because you don't want to hurt them. That's still control. It can take a while to see what's happening. In the beginning, the relationship might feel like the best thing that's ever happened to you. But real love doesn't pressure you. It doesn't ask you to move fast or give up your comfort. It doesn't punish you for saying no. Love bombing does all those things. It uses affection to cover up control. It gives too much too soon, then expects everything in return. By the time you realize what's going on, it might feel too late to leave. You've shared personal stories. You've imagined a future together. You've told your friends and family how good it is, but if the affection was never stable, if it depended on your agreement and obedience, it wasn't safe to begin with. You may notice the pattern repeats. Things get intense, then hard, then intense again. Every rough patch ends with more affection, more promises. I'll do better. Let's start fresh. The cycle resets, but the pressure stays. You're always trying to get back to how it felt in the beginning. That beginning wasn't real. It was a tactic to keep you close. You're not wrong for being drawn to love bombing. It feels good at first. That's why it works. But if you feel like you're on a roller coaster, if you can't say no without a fallout, if the affection comes with pressure, those are signs that you're close. Onto love bombing. Can fix it if they just try harder. In group settings, the illusion of control can lead to collective overconfidence. A team might push ahead with a risky plan, convinced they have all the tools to everything right, and still lose. The just world hypothesis ignores all that. It turns luck into justice and chance into punishment. It says, without saying it, that people bring their suffering on themselves. This belief shows up early. Even young children assume that if someone is hurt or poor, they must have done something to deserve it. Studies have shown that kids watching a puppet show, where one puppet is treated kindly and another badly, often think the kind puppet did something right and the other did something wrong. They don't know the full story, but they assume fairness. As people get older, this belief can harden. A man sees someone begging on the street and thinks they must be lazy. A woman hears about a friend's illness and quietly wonders if stress or lifestyle played a role. She doesn't mean harm, but the thought is there. Something must have caused this. That's how the just world hypothesis protects people. It says, if I don't do what they did, that won't happen to me. It also makes it easier to look away. If you believe others caused their own problems, you feel less pressure to help. A person who sees poverty as a result of laziness is less likely to support social programs. A person who thinks illness is tied to personal choices may ignore the needs of someone suffering. The belief shifts blame from systems and circumstances to the individual. It keeps the world simple and moral, but it does so at a cost. In criminal cases, this thinking plays out in how people treat victims. A woman reports being assaulted. People question what she wore, whether she drank, or if she led someone on. The questions come from doubt, but also from fear. If you accept that bad things can happen for no reason, then they could happen to anyone. It's easier to believe that the victim did something wrong. That way, you can feel safe by avoiding the same mistake. Juries sometimes make decisions based on this belief. They may downplay a victim's suffering or side with a powerful defendant. They might think, even without proof, that the person brought it on themselves. This isn't always conscious. The just world hypothesis works quietly. It shapes judgment in ways that feel fair but aren't. In the workplace, people who succeed are often seen as more deserving than they are. A manager gets credit for a successful project, and people assume they're smarter or harder working than others. But maybe they had a better team or better timing. The belief in a just world smooths over that complexity. It says outcomes reflect effort, not luck. The same thing happens in schools. A student who excels is praised for their drive. A student who struggles is seen as lazy or careless. But effort doesn't always lead to the same result. Some students have more support at home. Some have health problems or jobs or stress that others don't see. Still, the belief holds. If you try hard enough, you'll succeed. So if you don't succeed, you must not have tried. This idea feeds into how people judge themselves too. Someone fails at a goal and assumes it's their fault. They don't account for the role of outside factors. They might think, if I had done things right, this wouldn't have happened. That thought can grow into guilt or shame. But the truth is, effort isn't always enough. Life doesn't follow a fair script. Media often supports the just world belief. Stories show characters getting what they deserve. The bad guy gets caught. The kind neighbor wins the lottery. The lazy character learns a lesson. These stories feel good. They match what people want to believe. But they're not always true to life. In real life, bad people win. Good people suffer. Effort doesn't always pay off, and justice doesn't always arrive. When people see something unfair, they try to explain it. That's part of the just world hypothesis, too. If someone is harmed and there's no clear cause, the mind looks for one. It bends the story to make it fit. A person might think they must have ignored the signs, or they were probably doing something risky. These thoughts aren't always cruel. They come from a need to make sense of things, but they often make the victim carry extra blame. In politics, the just world belief can shape views on policy. People who believe strongly in a fair world often oppose welfare programs, housing aid, or minimum wage laws. They think helping people too much rewards bad choices. They believe that if someone is poor, it's because they didn't work hard. They see fairness not in equal support, but in earned outcomes. The belief blocks empathy. It also ignores the role of luck, inheritance, education, and opportunity. This belief is hard to let go of. It gives people a sense of order. It says the world makes sense. If you accept that life is random and unfair, it can feel like you've lost control. So people cling to the idea that outcomes match behavior. That belief doesn't match reality, but it brings comfort. It's important to recognize when this belief shows up. You hear someone's story and you think, they should have known better, or that wouldn't happen to me. It's easy to say that from the outside, but often people do their best and things still go wrong. The system breaks. The luck runs out. You're watching a movie and don't notice that the main character's shirt changes color between shots. You're reading a report, and no one in the room realizes the chart has switched labels halfway through. You walk into your living room, and it takes you 5 minutes to notice someone moved a chair. These are all examples of change blindness. When you fail to see a difference in a scene, even when it's obvious in hindsight. This isn't about attention span or memory. It's about how the brain processes visual information. You don't take in every detail of the world around you. You take in enough to get by. Your brain builds a rough model of your surroundings and focuses on what seems important at the time. If something changes outside that focus, you might not notice it. In one experiment, researchers filmed a short scene of two people talking. During the conversation, the camera cut between different angles. In one version, a table in the background had a red cloth. In the next shot, the cloth was green. Most people watching didn't notice. They were focused on the dialogue and the faces. The background seemed stable, so their brains didn't check for changes. Another experiment took this further. A researcher approached people on a college campus and asked for directions. During the conversation, two men carrying a door walked between the researcher and the subject. While the door blocked the view, the original researcher switched places with another person. Different height, different clothes, even a different voice. About half the people giving directions didn't notice the switch. They kept talking as if nothing had changed. That's change blindness in action. It shows up in day-to-day life more than you might think. You might drive your usual route and not see that a store's sign has changed. You might walk into a kitchen and not realize someone moved the toaster. These changes aren't hidden. Your eyes see them, but your brain doesn't register them unless they matter to the task at hand. If the change doesn't cause a problem or draw your attention, it might pass by unnoticed. Change blindness isn't about being careless. It's a side effect of how visual perception works. The brain can't handle every pixel of input at once, so it simplifies. It picks out the major pieces, the faces, the motion, the things that relate to your goals. It assumes the rest will stay the same unless there's a reason to think otherwise. When something changes slowly or during a break in vision, like a blink, a glance away, or a camera cut, the brain is less likely to catch it. It fills in the gap with what it expects. If you think the scene is stable, your mind keeps it that way. You don't notice the switch because the change didn't register as important or surprising. This becomes a problem in fields where noticing changes matters. A radiologist might miss a difference between two medical scans taken at different times. A security guard might not see that a person in a video feed has switched jackets. A pilot might overlook a changed instrument reading during a checklist. In each case, the person is trained, focused, and experienced. But the brain still makes assumptions. Designers of control panels and dashboards try to account for this. They use bright colors, flashing lights, or audible alerts to draw attention to changes. These cues break through the brain's habit of filling in the blanks. they force the eyes and the mind to look again. Without these signals, it's easy to miss something critical, even when it's right in front of you. In group settings, change blindness can go unnoticed for longer. Everyone assumes someone else saw the change. This is especially true when people trust that the system is working. If a display screen in a meeting room suddenly flips to the wrong version of a slide, it might take several minutes for anyone to speak up. People assume it's a glitch or that someone else is in charge of it. The longer the change goes unchallenged, the more normal it starts to seem. This can happen in conversations too. A friend might change their tone or body language in a subtle way. You might not notice because your mind is focused on the words, not the shift in behavior. By the time you realize something's wrong, the moment has passed. You weren't being cold or distracted. You just didn't catch the change as it happened. It also happens during written tasks. An editor might read a sentence several times and miss that a key word changed during revisions. A student might look at a math problem and not see that a minus sign became a plus. If the structure and context stay the same, the brain reads what it expects to see. It smooths over the differences. You don't notice the change because it fits the pattern. Digital interfaces can make this worse. Pop-up alerts, drop-downs, and shifting layouts often change while you're not looking. You click a button and the page updates behind the scenes. A label moves, a form resets. You don't see it because your eyes are in the wrong place. The interface changed during a moment when your attention was somewhere else. That's why good software design tries to avoid surprise changes. It keeps things visible, consistent, and stable. Because designers know users miss things they don't expect to change. The same issue appears in eyewitness accounts. Two people can watch the same event and disagree about what happened. Part of that comes from attention. If you're focused on one detail, a loud sound, a sudden movement, you might miss a change happening nearby. Even if the event is recorded, your memory might smooth over the gaps. You might say, "I'm sure that person was wearing a blue jacket," when they were actually wearing gray. Your brain filled in what it expected. In storytelling, filmmakers and writers sometimes use this to their advantage. A movie scene might include a small change, a prop in a new place, a detail on the wall, and most viewers won't catch it. When the twist comes, the film shows the change, and people feel surprised. It's not that the change was hidden, it's that they weren't looking for it. Magicians rely on this too. During a trick, they shift something small. An object disappears, a card changes, and most of the audience misses it. The magician distracts the crowd with a gesture, a sound, or a question. The change happens in plain view, but under the cover of misdirection. The audience looks without seeing. In daily life, change blindness reminds you that your view of the world isn't as complete as it feels. You see enough to move through your tasks, hold a conversation, or scan a room. But you don't see everything, and you miss more than you realize. That doesn't mean you're not paying attention. It means attention works in a focused, limited way. Knowing that helps in practical ways. When you review a document, don't assume you'll spot every difference. Use tools that highlight changes. When you return to a familiar space, take a moment to actually look around. Don't rely on memory to tell you what's there. If you're comparing images or reviewing reports, make side-by-side checks instead of trusting your eyes to remember what came before. You can't eliminate change blindness. You're halfway through a movie that isn't good. You know it's not going to get better. The plot makes no sense. The acting is flat. You're not enjoying it, but you keep watching. You've already spent an hour, and it feels like a waste to stop now. That's the sunk cost fallacy. It's the tendency to keep going with something just because you've already put time, money, or effort into it. The costs are already gone. They're sunk. But instead of looking forward, asking what's best from this point on, you look backward. You treat the investment as a reason to stay, even when quitting makes more sense. People do this with meals too. You order a large plate of food. Halfway through, you're full, but you keep eating. You paid for it, and leaving food behind feels like throwing money away. The money's already spent. It's not coming back. But the fallacy makes it feel like finishing the meal honors the cost. It happens in relationships. Someone stays in a long-term relationship that isn't working. They argue all the time, don't feel connected, and want different things. But they've been together for 5 years. That time becomes the reason to stay. They say, I've already put so much into this. That's the sunk cost fallacy speaking. The past effort doesn't guarantee a better future. It doesn't increase the chance that things will improve. But it weighs heavily in the decision to keep going. You see it in business all the time. A company starts a project, it costs more than expected. The deadlines stretch, the goals keep shifting. The team knows it won't meet its original targets, but leadership pushes on. Millions have already been spent. Stopping now would make that investment feel like a waste, so they throw more money at it, hoping to justify what's already gone. That often leads to even bigger losses. In public infrastructure, this effect can drag on for years. A city builds part of a new subway system. Costs spiral, voters complain. Engineers say the plan doesn't solve the problem it set out to fix. But politicians say they can't stop now. They've already dug the tunnels. They've already paid the contractors. It's too late to quit. The sunk cost fallacy drives the project forward, even when turning back would save time and money. People fall into this trap in education too. Someone goes to law school. In the second year, they realize they don't like law, but they keep going. They've already borrowed the money. They've already studied for countless hours. Friends and family expect them to finish. They say, I've come this far. So they stay, they graduate, they pass the bar, they work a job they don't enjoy. All because stopping would mean admitting that the time and money spent so far didn't lead to the right outcome. The fallacy feels reasonable because people don't like to waste effort. They want their work to matter. They want their choices to pay off. Giving up feels like failure. It feels like all the time, money, or emotion was for nothing. So they push ahead even when the cost of continuing is higher than the cost of stopping. The smart move is to look at the situation as it is now. Forget the time you've already spent. Forget the money that's already gone. Ask what the next step is worth. If the path ahead doesn't lead anywhere useful, it doesn't matter how long you've been on it. The best choice might be to walk away. Casinos count on this kind of thinking. A gambler loses money but keeps playing. They say, I need to win it back. They've already lost $500, so they bet another $100, trying to turn it around. But the odds haven't changed. The earlier losses don't improve their chances. But quitting would mean accepting the loss, and that's hard to do. So they keep playing. Video games use it too. Some games are built around time investment. You grind for hours to reach the next level or unlock a reward. If you find you're halfway through a movie that isn't good, you know it's not going to get better. The plot makes no sense. The acting is flat. You're not enjoying it, but you keep watching. You've already spent an hour, and it feels like a waste to stop now. That's the sunk cost fallacy. It's the tendency to keep going with something just because you've already put time, money, or effort into it. The costs are already gone. They're sunk. But instead of looking forward, asking what's best from this point on, you look backward. You treat the investment as a reason to stay, even when quitting makes more sense. People do this with meals too. You order a large plate of food. Halfway through, you're full, but you keep eating. You paid for it, and leaving food behind feels like throwing money away. The money's already spent. It's not coming back. But the fallacy makes it feel like finishing the meal honors the cost. It happens in relationships. Someone stays in a long-term relationship that isn't working. They argue all the time, don't feel connected, and want different things. But they've been together for 5 years. That time becomes the reason to stay. They say, I've already put so much into this. That's the sunk cost fallacy speaking. The past effort doesn't guarantee a better future. It doesn't increase the chance that things will improve. But it weighs heavily in the decision to keep going. You see it in business all the time. A company starts a project, it costs more than expected. The deadlines stretch, the goals keep shifting. The team knows it won't meet its original targets, but leadership pushes on. Millions have already been spent. Stopping now would make that investment feel like a waste, so they throw more money at it, hoping to justify what's already gone. That often leads to even bigger losses. In public infrastructure, this effect can drag on for years. A city builds part of a new subway system. Costs spiral. Voters complain. Engineers say the plan doesn't solve the problem it set out to fix. But politicians say they can't stop now. They've already dug the tunnels. They've already paid the contractors. It's too late to quit. The sunk cost fallacy drives the project forward, even when turning back would save time and money. People fall into this trap in education too. Someone goes to law school. In the second year, they realize they don't like law, but they keep going. They've already borrowed the money. They've already studied for countless hours. Friends and family expect them to finish. They say, "I've come this far." So you remember where you were when you heard the news. You remember what you were doing, what you were wearing, and even what the room smelled like. Maybe it was the moment a famous person died. Maybe it was when the towers fell. Maybe it was when a loved one told you something that changed your life. The memory feels sharp, clear. You can picture it like it just happened. You trust it without question. That's what makes flashbulb memories feel so powerful. But they're not always right. A flashbulb memory is a vivid recollection of where you were and what you were doing when something emotionally intense or shocking happened. It's called that because the moment seems frozen, like it was lit up by a camera flash. The details feel locked in. But the truth is, these memories often contain errors. People remember them with confidence, but the accuracy doesn't match the certainty. Researchers have studied this for decades. One early study asked college students where they were when they heard about the Challenger explosion in 1986. The day after the disaster, students wrote down everything they could remember: where they were, who they were with, how they felt. Years later, the researchers followed up. The same students were asked to recall the event again. Most of them gave different answers. Their news stories didn't match what they wrote down the first time. Some details shifted a little, others changed completely. When shown their original answers, many said the new memory felt more real. The vividness made them trust it, even though the record showed otherwise. That's the core of the illusion. You think vivid equals accurate, but it doesn't. The memory feels full of detail, but some of those details were added later. Maybe you saw news coverage and folded that into your own version. Maybe you talked to someone else and their experience blended with yours. Maybe your brain filled in gaps with what made sense. None of this feels like guessing. It feels like remembering. But it's not reliable. This illusion shows up again and again. After the September 11 attacks, researchers asked people to describe how they heard the news. Where were they? What were they doing? What did they feel? They came back a year later, then again after 3 years. People stuck to their stories, but many of the details had shifted. What stayed the same was the confidence. They believed the memory was accurate, even when the facts didn't match. Part of the reason is emotional intensity. Strong feelings make memories more likely to form, but not more likely to be correct. The brain treats emotional events differently. It stores them with more weight, but that doesn't mean it captures them with more precision. It just means you're more likely to remember something happened, not that you remember exactly how it happened. Your brain isn't a camera. It doesn't record everything. It builds memories by stitching pieces together. It stores the major parts, then fills in the blanks later. If something feels important, your brain adds detail. Not because it's true, but because it seems like it should be. That's how people end up with false clarity. They remember hearing about a major event on the radio, even though they didn't own a radio at the time. They picture themselves in a place they weren't. They recall a facial expression or a quote that didn't happen. The story has been shaped by time, emotion, and outside information. People aren't lying when they get these things wrong. They're not exaggerating. They believe what they're saying. That's what makes flashbulb memory illusions so convincing. You're sure of what you remember, and that certainty keeps you from checking it. You don't ask if it makes sense because it feels so clear. It also affects how people tell stories. One person describes their version of the event, and others hear it and nod. It sounds familiar, so they absorb parts of it. They fold it into their own memory. The next time they tell the story, those details are part of it. It's not copying, it's merging. The mind uses what fits, what feels right, even if it didn't happen that way. Media coverage can do the same thing. You watch a video or read an article, and it feels like your own memory. Over time, the line between what you saw and what you experienced blurs. You might remember the footage as something you saw live, even if you saw it later. You might describe scenes from the news as if they were part of your own environment. This isn't about confusion. It's about how memory pulls from everything available, not just what happened, but what's been told, shown, and imagined. This also happens with personal events. Someone might remember the moment they learned a family member had passed away. They remember sitting on a couch, holding a phone, hearing the words. But over time, the color of the couch might change. The time of day might shift. A window might appear in the room that wasn't there. The core moment feels the same, but the scene around it is flexible. And because the event is so personal, the memory feels sacred. Questioning it feels wrong. But even sacred memories can carry errors. Eyewitness accounts can suffer from this. A person sees a crime or an accident and is later asked to recall it. They give details that sound precise: what someone wore, the order of events, the weather, but later evidence might show it didn't happen that way. Even when shown proof, the witness might stick to their version. That's how strong flashbulb memories can feel. The illusion of accuracy leads people to resist correction. This matters in courtrooms, in newsrooms, and in everyday conversations. People rely on memory to make decisions. But when memory is vivid and wrong, it can cause problems. Someone might accuse the wrong person. Someone else might insist something happened when it didn't. Two people might remember the same moment in completely different ways, each sure they're right. It helps to understand how this illusion works. Strong emotion boosts memory, but it also increases the chance of distortion. Details feel sharp, but that sharpness can be misleading. Over time, new information sneaks in. The memory feels unchanged, but it's not. What you remember might be a blend of truth and assumption, fact and feeling. You might remember exactly what you said during an argument 5 years ago. You might picture the room, the tone, the silence afterward. But your memory may be pulling from other arguments or from stories you've told yourself since then. That doesn't mean the memory is worthless, but it does mean it's not perfect. Even in positive moments, this shows up. A couple might both remember the moment they got engaged. One says it happened during dinner. The other swears it was before. Both describe the weather, the waiter, the music. Both are sure, but they can't both be right. Time has shaped the story. Emotion made it stick, but accuracy didn't. The brain works this way, not because it's broken, but because it's efficient. It prioritizes what matters. It saves space by using patterns. It doesn't need to store every detail. You spill coffee on your shirt before a meeting. As you walk in, you feel like everyone notices. You keep your arms crossed. You sit low in your chair. You avoid eye contact. You think people are staring or judging. But the truth is, they probably didn't notice at all. And if they did, they didn't think much of it. That feeling, that sense that a spotlight is following you around, is called the spotlight effect. It's the tendency to believe that other people are paying more attention to you than they actually are. You feel like your actions, your appearance, and your mistakes stand out. But to most people around you, they don't. Everyone else is too focused on themselves to notice everything you do. But your mind doesn't work that way. It puts you at the center of your own experience, and it assumes others see what you see. Psychologists first studied this idea by doing something simple. They asked college students to wear a t-shirt with a large picture of a pop singer, someone most people wouldn't want to wear in public. Then they asked the students to walk into a room full of strangers. The students guessed how many people would notice the shirt. On average, they thought about half the room would see it. In reality, it was much less. Only about a quarter noticed. That gap between what people expected and what others actually saw shows how the spotlight effect works. You think your choices stand out more than they do. You think your mistakes are more visible than they are. But most people are wrapped up in their own thoughts, just like you are. They're not looking at you as closely as you think. This plays out in everyday moments. You stumble on your words during a presentation and feel embarrassed. You're sure the mistake ruined your credibility. But later, if you ask someone what they thought, they barely remember it. They remember your main point, or your energy, or or your examples, the stumble didn't matter. You saw it as the main event. They saw it as a blip. It also happens in casual settings. You're walking down the street and realize your shirt is on inside out. You think everyone can tell. You feel exposed, but people walking by don't look at your shirt. They're looking at their phones. They're thinking about lunch or their to-do list. If they do glance, they probably forget what they saw within seconds. Even in conversations, this shows up. You say something awkward at a party and replay it all night. You picture the other person thinking about it, judging you, talking about it later. But chances are, they moved on right away. Maybe they didn't even notice. Maybe they were too focused on what they were about to say. You think the spotlight is on you. They think the spotlight is on them. The spotlight effect also makes people overthink how they come across. Before a big meeting or date, someone might spend too much time picking the right outfit, rehearsing what to say, or trying to appear a certain way. They assume small choices will make a big impression, but the other person usually isn't tracking those details. They're forming a general impression, not scoring every move. In classrooms, students sometimes avoid raising their hands because they're afraid of giving a wrong answer. They imagine everyone watching, waiting, judging. But in most cases, other students aren't focused on them. They're thinking about their own answers, or hoping they won't be called on. The student feels exposed. But to the rest of the room, it's just another moment. It doesn't stop in adulthood. In the workplace, someone might avoid speaking up in a meeting because they're afraid of sounding unprepared. They picture the whole room listening closely, analyzing every word. But most people in the room are thinking about their own tasks. They're checking the time, reviewing notes, or thinking about what to say next. The spotlight you feel often doesn't exist. This also applies to appearance. Someone gets a haircut they're unsure about and expects a wave of comments. They walk into work or school waiting for reactions, but most people don't notice. Or they notice and don't mention it. Or they mention it once and move on. What feels huge to you is just a detail to others. They're too busy thinking about how they look or feel to spend long thinking about you. The spotlight effect also plays a role in social anxiety. Someone might feel nervous entering a room, believing everyone is watching and evaluating them. That belief adds pressure. But in reality, most people aren't watching. They're scanning the room the same way, wondering how they're being seen. It's a loop. Everyone feels watched. No one is really watching. Part of this comes from how memory works. You remember your own experiences in detail. You know what you wore, what you said, how you felt, but you don't remember other people's moments with the same clarity. That creates an imbalance. You assume others remember your actions the same way you do, but they don't. Their memory of your moment is probably vague or gone altogether. Even online, this shows up. You post something and worry that everyone is judging it. You check to see who liked it, who didn't, who might have seen it but stayed silent. You feel exposed. But most people scroll fast. They see 100 things in an hour. Your post is one of many. It's not that it doesn't matter. It just doesn't stand out the way you think it does. Sometimes the spotlight effect makes people avoid doing things they want to do. Someone wants to take a dance class but worries about looking awkward. They imagine being the focus of the room. But most people in the class are beginners too. They're focused on their own movements, not watching others. Once the class starts, no one cares who messes up a step. But the imagined spotlight keeps some people from trying. The spotlight effect can also affect how people interpret silence. You say something and someone doesn't respond the way you hoped. You assume it's because of what you said, but maybe they were tired, maybe they were distracted, maybe it had nothing to do with you. But the feel, music, and what someone said that made everyone laugh. Your friend pauses and says, "I was at that party. That didn't happen to you. That happened to me." You stop and think. The memory feels real. It feels like it's yours, but it's not. You remembered the event, but you got the source wrong. That's misattribution of memory. This happens when you recall something correctly, but mistake where it came from. You might remember the content of a story, a face, or a piece of information, but assign it to the wrong time, place, or person. You know the fact, but not how you learned it. You know the event, but not who experienced it. You mix up the pieces, and because the memory feels complete, you trust it. This isn't about lying or exaggerating. It's not about making things up. It's a mistake that happens inside your brain without your awareness. The memory itself can be clear, but the context is off. And when the context feels right, it's hard to notice the mistake. People do this with facts all the time. You might repeat something you heard on the radio, thinking you read it in a book. You might hear a story from a friend and later repeat it as something that happened to you. It's not a conscious choice. The brain just doesn't tag memories as clearly as people think. Over time, the lines blur. The source gets lost. It happens with faces too. You see someone at the store and feel like you know them. Maybe you smile, maybe you start a conversation, but later you realize you don't know them at all. You saw them in a different place, a TV show, a work training, someone else's social media. You remembered the face, but not the setting. That kind of mistake can feel strange, but it's common. Your brain is good at remembering patterns, but not always great at linking them to the right place. One well-known study showed how this works. Participants watched a video of a man reading a list of words. Later, they saw a separate video of a robbery. When asked to identify the thief, many people picked the man from the first video. He wasn't in the robbery video at all, but his face was familiar, and that familiarity felt like evidence. People assumed they recognized him from the crime. They didn't. Their memory was accurate about the face, but wrong about the context. This kind of mistake can lead to real consequences. In legal settings, eyewitness testimony is often seen as powerful evidence. But if a witness sees someone earlier in a different situation, on a bus, at a store, in a lineup, their brain might connect that face to the wrong event. They believe what they're saying. They're not trying to mislead anyone, but the misattribution leads them to point to the wrong person. In daily life, this effect is more subtle. You quote someone in a conversation and later realize they didn't say it. You read a fact online and forget the source, so you credit it to a person you trust. You pass along a story you think came from your own life, only to be corrected by someone who says, "That was my story. I told you that." It even happens with dreams. You might remember something strange and tell someone about it, believing it happened last week, but it didn't. It was part of a dream. The content feels real enough that the brain places it in the waking world. The emotional tone fits, and that's enough for the brain to misfile the memory. Memory is not a fixed record. It's a system of reconstruction. When you remember something, you're not pulling a file off a shelf. You're piecing together fragments. Some are visual, some are verbal, some are emotional. The brain tries to build a coherent story. Most of the time, it works well. But when one of those fragments is out of place, like the source, you get a clean, confident memory with one key error. This is also why people sometimes argue over who first came up with an idea. Two people work on a project. One remembers pitching a suggestion early on. The other remembers being the one who said it. Both believe they're right. Both might be wrong, or one of them misattributed the idea to themselves. It's not about ego or stealing credit. It's about how memory assigns ownership. If you picture the moment clearly and hear your own voice in your head, it feels like yours. But that voice might have come from later, not from the original scene. Songs, jokes, and stories also fall into this trap. You hear something once, then repeat it. A week later, you share it again, but forget you didn't come up with it. The line rolls off your tongue and you feel clever. It's only later you realize it wasn't yours. That's cryptomnesia, a specific kind of misattribution where you think a borrowed idea is original. It happens to artists, writers, musicians, and everyday people. It's not theft, it's a memory error. Technology doesn't always help. With so many sources of information, videos, podcasts, texts, tweets, the brain has more content than it can neatly label. You might remember a headline, but forget whether it was news or satire. You might recall a quote, but not know if it came from a journalist or a friend. If the tone fits what you believe, you're more likely to trust it, even if the source is wrong. Misattribution also plays into how people build personal narratives. You remember an event from childhood and repeat it over the years, but maybe it wasn't your memory. Maybe it was a story your sibling told you. Maybe it was a photo you saw, not an experience you had. Over time, your brain fills in the missing parts, and it becomes part of your own story. You believe it, and you're not alone. It happens in families, in friendships, and in shared histories. These errors don't mean you're forgetful. They don't mean you're dishonest. They mean memory is flexible. It's always being shaped, not just by what happened, but by what you've heard, seen, and imagined. You might feel sure a memory is yours, when really it's a mix of different inputs, a real event, a story from someone else, a photo in an album. You can't always prevent misattribution, but you can become aware of it. When a memory feels especially vivid, it helps to pause and ask where it came from. Did you experience it directly? Did someone tell you? Did you see it on a screen? Just asking that question can help. It reminds you that even strong memories are built, not stored, and that the truth of what happened may not always match the clarity of what you remember. Did you see it different? You feel confused. The memory felt real. You weren't guessing. You weren't alone. That's the Mandela effect. It happens when a group of people remembers something that didn't actually happen, or remembers it differently than how it happened. These are not just small errors, they're shared, confident beliefs about events, names, or images that don't match the record. The term comes from people who remembered Nelson Mandela dying in prison during the 1980s. They remembered seeing the funeral. They remembered the news coverage. But Mandela didn't die in prison. He was released, became president of South Africa, and died decades later in 2013. Still, the false memory stuck. It wasn't just one person. It was many, across countries and backgrounds, all describing similar details. That's what makes the Mandela effect different from everyday forgetfulness. It's not one person getting it wrong. It's whole groups remembering the same wrong thing. There are other examples that show how strong this can be. People often remember the children's book series, The Berenstain Bears, as the Berenstain Bears. They say they read it that way. They saw the covers. They talked about it. The name Berenstain feels right, while Berenstain looks wrong. But if you check the original books, it's always been Berenstain. The memories are vivid, but they don't match the facts. Another common one is the Monopoly Man. Many people remember him wearing a monocle. They picture him clearly, top hat, cane, monocle. But if you look at the actual game, there is no monocle. He never had one. The image feels right because it fits a certain type of character. Rich, formal. You fill in the detail because it fits the idea, not because it was there. The line from Star Wars, "Luke, I am your father," is also part of this. That phrase is quoted everywhere. It's used in ads, jokes, and impressions. But it's not what Darth Vader says. The actual line is, "No, I am your father." The change is small, but the incorrect version feels more complete. It tells you who he's talking to. Over time, people repeat the wrong version so often that it becomes the one they remember. This effect isn't limited to pop culture. People remember events happening in different years or in different orders. They remember quotes from speeches or books that were never actually said. They remember countries on maps being in slightly different spots. The memories come with strong conviction. When told the truth, people don't just say, "Oh, I forgot." They say, "That's not right. I know what I saw." So where does this come from? It helps to understand how memory works. Memory isn't a recording, it's a reconstruction. Each time you remember something, your brain puts the pieces together again. If a few pieces are missing, your brain fills them in. It uses patterns, expectations, and context to complete the picture. Most of the time, this works, but sometimes it creates something that feels right but isn't true. When many people make the same false reconstruction, you get a shared error. That can happen when the same outside influence affects how people remember. Media, repeated phrases, and visual cues can all shape memory. If you see a misquote in a movie, then hear a friend repeat it, then see it in a meme, your brain treats it as fact. Not because you checked it, but because it's familiar. Familiar things feel true, even when they're wrong. Social reinforcement plays a role too. If someone says, "I remember it this way," and you have a faint or fuzzy memory, you might agree. Not because you're trying to fit in, but because the story fills in your blanks. You trust the group. Over time, you start to remember it that way too. Now it feels like your own memory. Even if the original source was wrong, your brain locks it in as true. False memories can also form when different memories overlap. If you read a lot of names that end in Stein and then see one that ends in Nash-Stain, your brain might switch it to match the others. If you saw other cartoon characters with monocles, your brain might attach that detail to the Monopoly Man. You're not inventing the memory from nothing. You're combining pieces in a way that makes sense to you. Some people try to explain the Mandela effect with ideas outside of psychology. They talk about alternate realities, glitches in memory, or shifts between timelines. These ideas are popular in science fiction and online forums, but they're not needed to explain what's happening. The mind alone is enough. Memory is powerful, but it's also prone to error. The fact that so many people can share the same mistake doesn't make it less of a mistake. It just shows how the same conditions can lead to the same wrong conclusion. The Mandela effect also shows up in how people remember personal experiences. Families sometimes argue over how something happened. Everyone agrees that the event took place, but the details don't match. One person swears the birthday party was at the park. Another says it was in the backyard. Both tell a full story with details, faces, and sounds. Both are confident, but only one can be right. Photographs and video can help settle these disputes, but even then, people sometimes question the evidence. They say, "That's not how I remember it." The feeling of memory is strong. When it's challenged, people resist. It's not just about the event, it's about trusting your own mind. That's part of what makes the Mandela effect so unsettling. It forces people to admit that something they were sure of is false, and not just them, but a whole group. That can shake your sense of reality. You might feel like you're losing grip on what's true, but what's really happening is more ordinary. The mind is doing what it always does, building stories from pieces, trying to make sense of the world, using shortcuts to save time. And sometimes those shortcuts lead to the same wrong turn. It helps to approach this with humility. Memory feels solid, but it isn't. When many people get something wrong in the same way, it doesn't mean something strange is happening. It means the brain works the same way in different people. It fills in gaps using shared experiences, language, and images. That's why the mistakes line up. That's why they feel so convincing. You can test this in small ways. Ask a few people to describe the Fruit of the Loom logo. You believe your opinion makes sense. You assume it's reasonable. You figure most people probably agree with you. That's where the false consensus effect comes in. It's the belief that your views, choices, and behaviors are more common than they really are. You don't just think your way is right, you think it's typical, but often it's not. This happens because your experience shapes how you see the world. You surround yourself with people who think like you, speak like you, and act like you. You talk about your views with friends and they nod along. You scroll through your feed and see posts that match your opinions. After a while, it feels like everyone must see things the same way. But outside your circle, that consensus may not exist. The effect shows up in simple decisions. You eat at a certain restaurant and assume it's everyone's favorite. You vote a certain way and assume it's the majority choice. You value a certain trait, punctuality, honesty, independence, and think most people hold it in the same way. When someone behaves differently, it feels odd. You think, how could they not see it the way I do? One classic study tested this by giving people a scenario. Imagine you're walking through campus and someone asks you to wear a sandwich board advertising a restaurant. Would you do it? Some people said yes, some said no. Then the researchers asked, what percentage of others do you think made the same choice as you? No matter what choice they made, most people believed the majority would agree with them. People who said yes thought most others would say yes. People who said no thought most would say no. That's the false consensus effect in action. People assumed their choice was the common one just because it made sense to them. You can see it in workplaces. A manager thinks a new policy is fair and assumes the team agrees. They don't ask for feedback because they think it's obvious. But when the policy rolls out, employees push back. The manager is surprised. They didn't expect disagreement because they believed their thinking was normal. They didn't realize how much of their view came from their role, not from shared understanding. In classrooms, this shows up in group projects. A student wants to take a certain approach. They assume everyone else sees it the same way. They push forward without checking in, but the rest of the group might be confused or opposed. The student doesn't see it coming because they believed their way of thinking was the default. The same thing happens in social situations. You make a joke and assume others will find it funny. You bring up a topic and assume people will find it interesting. When the room goes quiet, you feel surprised. You thought your view was shared, but it wasn't. You weren't wrong to think it was a good idea. You just overestimated how widely that idea was held. Politics is full of false consensus. You live in a town where most people vote one way. You talk to neighbors, read local papers, watch local news. When an election happens and the results don't go your way, it feels like something went wrong. But the surprise isn't about fraud or trickery. It's about scale. Your world looked like the whole world, but it wasn't. This effect is stronger when emotions are involved. If you care deeply about something, it's harder to imagine others not caring in the same way. You value a cause, so you assume others do too. You feel angry about an issue, so you expect others to be just as outraged. When they're not, you feel confused or even betrayed. But they might not see the same facts or value the same outcomes. They might not be wrong. They might just be different. It also plays out in disagreements. When someone holds an opposing view, you may assume they're in the minority. You might think, most people are on my side. That belief makes it easier to dismiss them. You don't ask why they think what they think. You assume they're the outlier. But in reality, they may be part of a group as large as yours, or larger. You just haven't seen it. Social media makes this worse. Algorithms show you what you like. They hide what you don't. You scroll and see views that match yours. You feel reinforced. You think, this is what people believe. But the platform is showing you a filtered version of the world. The more time you spend in that space, the more normal your view feels, and the harder it becomes to understand disagreement. This can create problems in communication. If you assume others agree with you, you might skip important context. You might use shorthand, references, or jokes that only make sense to people who share your view. That can leave others out. They might feel confused, or worse, attacked. You didn't mean to alienate them. You just assumed they were already on the same page. The false consensus effect also affects how we judge behavior. If someone breaks a rule you believe in, you assume they did it on purpose. You think they know better. But maybe they don't. Maybe they weren't taught the same values. Maybe they come from a different place with different norms. If you believe your view is the standard, you'll see their actions as a personal choice. But if you see your view as one among many, you might look for a different explanation. Even in relationships, this shows up. You assume your partner shares your view on money, time, or family. You expect them to act a certain way because it's how you would act. When they don't, it feels like they're being difficult. But they might be acting on a different idea of what's normal. The conflict doesn't come from malice, it comes from mismatched assumptions. The false consensus effect is not about arrogance, it's about being human. You live in your mind, you see the world from your eyes. That makes your view feel like the default. And when others agree with you, even a few, it feels like proof. But the world is bigger than your experience. There are more views than you see each day, more values than you talk about with your friends. You can't avoid this effect completely, but you can notice when it shows up. If you find yourself thinking, of course everyone agrees, pause. Ask yourself how you know that. Ask whether you've checked. Look for signs that your circle might be narrow. Try to talk to someone outside it. You might still hold the same view, but now you'll see it in a broader frame. That shift makes it easier to listen. It makes disagreement less personal. It reminds you that your beliefs aren't less valid, but they're not universal either. What feels obvious to you might be unfamiliar to someone else. And that gap is you're in a meeting. A decision is being made. You're not sure it's the right one. Maybe you see a flaw in the plan, or you notice a missing step. You want to say something, but everyone else seems to agree. Heads nod around the table. Someone speaks with confidence. No one raises a question. You keep quiet. You go along with it. That's groupthink. It happens when people in a group avoid conflict by agreeing with the majority, even if they have doubts. They might sense a problem or see another option, but they don't speak up. They don't want to seem negative or difficult or out of step, so they say nothing. The group moves forward with a decision that feels unified, but only because no one challenged it. Groupthink is not about being weak or passive. It's about how groups work. When people want to get along, they smooth over disagreement. When they feel pressure to decide quickly, they avoid slowing things down. When the group has a clear leader or a strong opinion, others often fall in line. No one wants to be the one who causes friction. So they put the group first and silence their own concerns. You see it in workplaces. A manager proposes a new policy. A few people speak up to agree. Others follow. Maybe someone in the room thinks the plan won't work. Maybe they know a better approach. But they stay quiet. They figure it's not worth pushing back. They trust the group to get it right. Or they think, maybe I'm the only one who sees the problem. The team leaves the room feeling united, but that agreement came at the cost of honest input. It happens in classrooms too. A teacher asks a question. One student answers. The answer is wrong, but sounds confident. No one else speaks. Some students know the right answer, but they doubt themselves. They assume the first person must be correct, or that it's not worth challenging them. They don't want to stand out, so they stay silent, and the class moves on with the wrong idea. Groupthink also plays out in hiring. A panel interviews a candidate. One person says the interview went well. Others agree, even if they had concerns. Maybe the candidate seemed underqualified. Maybe they didn't answer key questions. But no one brings it up. They want to avoid conflict. They want the meeting to end. The group makes a decision based on harmony, not on the best judgment of each person in the room. In social groups, the same effect shows up. A group of friends makes a plan. One person wants to suggest a different idea, but doesn't want to rock the boat. They smile and agree, even though they don't like the plan. Later, they might feel frustrated or left out. But in the moment, going along felt easier than pushing back. The problem with groupthink is that it feels like agreement. Everyone seems to be on the same page. The room feels calm. The decision feels smooth. But that calm often hides disagreement. People hold back ideas or concerns to keep things easy. That's when mistakes slip through. One example that's often used to explain groupthink is the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. A group of US officials planned an attack on Cuba. Many of them had doubts. They worried the plan wouldn't work, but they didn't speak up. The group around President Kennedy seemed to agree, and no one wanted to break that sense of unity. The result was a failed operation that most people later agreed should have been stopped before it started. Another example is the Challenger space shuttle disaster in 1986. Engineers had concerns about the shuttle's safety, especially in cold weather. Some of those concerns reached NASA officials, but the pressure to launch, the excitement of the mission, and the appearance of consensus all played a role in the final decision to proceed. The shuttle exploded shortly after takeoff, killing all 7 crew members. Later investigations showed that key voices were ignored or silenced by the group dynamic. Groupthink doesn't always lead to disasters, but it often leads to weaker decisions. The group might miss better options. It might ignore warning signs. It might stick with the first idea just because it came early and no one wanted to challenge it. It's easy to fall into. People want to be liked. They want to belong. They don't want to be the one who says, "I disagree." They might think it's not their place. They might assume others know better. If they don't see anyone else raising a hand, they feel alone. That silence spreads. Each person's quiet reinforces the next person's doubt. Leaders sometimes make groupthink worse without meaning to. They speak early or speak with certainty, and the group follows. A leader might ask, "Everyone good with this?" And most people will nod, even if they're unsure. It takes effort to create space for disagreement. It takes time to invite other views and patience to listen when they come. You don't need a large group for groupthink to happen. It can show up in pairs. 2 people planning a trip. One wants to suggest a different destination, but doesn't want to seem difficult. The other assumes everything's fine. They both agree on something neither really wants. The process was smooth, but the outcome wasn't right for either one. This effect can even show up in online spaces. A post gets popular, and people agree in the comments. Someone with a different view reads it, but doesn't comment. They don't want to be the only one pushing back. They might think it's not worth it. That's how the thread stays one-sided. Not because everyone agrees, but because disagreement is missing. Groupthink doesn't mean people are weak-minded. It means they're social. They care about harmony. They weigh the cost of speaking up against the risk of being wrong or isolated. In some cases, they decide silence is safer. That's not laziness. It's human nature. You can spot groupthink by watching how quickly a group moves to agreement. If a complex issue gets settled too fast, it might mean no one felt safe speaking up. If no one asks a question or challenges a point, it doesn't always mean everyone agrees. It might mean they didn't feel comfortable disagreeing. Real consensus takes time. It includes pushback. It includes the risk of discomfort. Avoiding groupthink means building space for dissent. Not just saying, "Tell me if you see a problem," but actively asking people what they do differently. It means making it okay to say, "I'm not sure," or "Can we look at another angle?" It also means slowing down decisions when the stakes are high. The urge to move quickly often invites silence. But a few extra minutes of honest feedback can make the difference between a mistake and a better outcome. The goal isn't to create conflict, it's to create trust. When people know their input is wanted, they're more likely to speak. When they see others question ideas without being punished or ignored, they're more likely to follow. And when groups welcome those voices, they don't just avoid mistakes, they make stronger decisions. Not because everyone thinks. You look back on a trip from a few years ago. It was only 10 days, but it feels like it lasted a month. You remember every morning, every meal, the streets you walked, the people you met. It takes up more space in your memory than the months before or after. That's time dilation in retrospect. It happens when busy. Full periods seem longer in hindsight than they were at the time. You weren't watching the clock when it was happening. In fact, it probably felt fast. But when you look back, the days feel stretched. You remember more, so the time feels bigger. Memory doesn't track time like a clock. It tracks events, changes, and moments that stand out. When a lot happens in a short span, your brain stores more memories. Later, when you try to estimate how long that period was, your mind uses the number of stored details as a guide. More details make it feel like more time passed. This is why vacations, moves, job changes, and life disruptions feel longer in memory. You do something new every day. You solve new problems, learn new routines, meet new people. That novelty sticks. The brain flags those experiences as worth storing. You end up with a dense, vivid memory that spans only a few days but feels like weeks. The opposite also happens. You look back at a month when nothing changed and it feels like it vanished. You worked the same hours, ate the same meals, followed the same schedule. There are fewer moments that stand out, so the memory feels thin. You didn't forget the time, it just didn't leave many marks. You can see this effect in childhood memories. A single school year from second grade might feel longer than the last 5 years combined. You learned new things almost every day. You had firsts, first field trip, first fight, first big test. You changed quickly. The world felt large and every detail had weight. Now, as an adult, time feels faster. A year passes and you can barely tell 1 week from the next. But that's not about speed. It's about how memory is recorded. When less stands out, the time feels shorter. The effect also shows up in travel. A flight to another country might feel long and slow, but when you remember the trip itself, it feels packed. You remember the hotel lobby, the first meal, the weather, the smell of the local market. You didn't do more hours than usual. You just did more different things. That difference makes the time expand in memory. In work, this becomes clear when you start a new job. The first month feels long. Every day has new tasks, new faces, new systems. You go home tired, full of information. You might even feel like you've been there for months. A year later, the same job feels fast. You know the routine. The days blur. You're not working less. You're just storing less that's new. The experience takes up less space in your mind. It's not about how fun or boring something is. It's about how much your brain has to notice. Boredom doesn't stretch memory. It just makes the time drag in the moment. But later, you look back and find nothing much there. You remember being bored, but not the details. That's why a slow afternoon can feel long while it's happening, but seem short a week later. The inverse is also true. A busy day might fly by, but feel long in memory because so much happened. This is why people often say time feels faster as they get older. The days are full, but not always different. You've seen most of the patterns before. You don't stop to notice small changes. Your brain knows what to expect, so it doesn't need to store everything. Years pass, and they feel light, not because they didn't matter, but because they didn't leave many memory markers. Time dilation in retrospect can also be emotional. If something big happened, an illness, a breakup, a move, you may remember the surrounding days as longer. That week when everything changed feels like a chapter. You remember waking up, who you talked to, what you ate. That stretch of time holds weight because it mattered. You felt it, and your brain held on to it. This also shows up during crises. Think about the early days of the pandemic. The first few weeks felt long. You remember the headlines, the press conferences, the rules changing day by day. That period might have been a month, but it holds a year's worth of memory. People learned new routines, faced uncertainty, changed habits. Those experiences got stored, and they stretched that time in hindsight. On the other hand, people often struggle to remember long, stable periods. A year at a steady job, a year in a familiar home, a year with no major change. Those times can feel like they vanished. You didn't stop to mark them. They weren't empty, but they blended together. When you try to remember them later, there's less to pull from. So your brain compresses them. They feel short, even though they were long. This effect shapes how people understand their own lives. You might say, last year flew by, or that trip felt like forever. And both statements are about memory, not time. They're about how much happened and how different it was from your usual pace. The more that happened, the more time it seems to hold. It's not a trick, it's how memory works. The mind doesn't log hours, it logs change. It stores what stands out. When you look back, you don't replay a timeline, you rebuild a story. The more pieces you have, the longer the story feels. The fewer pieces, the quicker the story moves. This also explains why looking back on certain times can make you feel nostalgic. It's not just the events, it's the density of the memory. You remember those weeks or months as full. They hold weight, they have texture, they feel real in a way that flat, repetitive time doesn't. You miss the feeling of a life where things stood out. You can test this effect yourself. Think about a busy weekend, one where you saw friends, ran errands, tried something new. Now think about a quiet week where you worked, ate dinner, and went to bed at the same time each night. The weekend probably felt fast while it was happening, but when you think about it now, it feels like more happened. The week felt slow in real time, but feels shorter now. The calendar says the week was longer. Your brain says the weekend was. Time dilation in retrospect isn't about confusion. It's about perspective. Your brain gives more space to the periods when more happened. It weighs them differently. That's why some short times feel long, and some long times feel like they slipped past unnoticed. You're not losing time. You're remembering it in proportion to how much of it your brain decided was worth keeping. When someone asks you to repeat them, you remember the last few most clearly. You go to a concert, and when it's over, you talk about the final songs, even though the earlier ones were just as good. You read a long article, and when you think back on it, the last paragraph is what sticks. That's the recency effect. It's the tendency to remember the most recent information better than what came before. This shows up in everyday situations. If someone gives you directions and says, turn left at the church, then right at the light, and finally park next to the red sign, you're more likely to remember red sign than church. The last detail stays fresh. If you forget part of the list, it's usually the beginning, not the end. This happens because of how short-term memory works. Your brain holds on to the last thing it heard or saw. That information is still in your working memory, ready to be used. The earlier pieces fade unless you make an effort to keep them there. You might rehearse them or connect them to something meaningful. But the last part needs no effort. It's already at the top of the stack. You see this in classrooms. A teacher ends a lecture with a key point, and students remember it. They forget the first half of the lesson, but they recall the final example or quote. That's not because the last part was more important. It's because it came last. The brain gave it priority because it was still in view. The same thing happens during job interviews. A candidate might give strong answers throughout, but it's their final comments that stick with the interviewer. If they end with a clear, confident summary, that's what gets remembered. If they end with hesitation, that leaves a different mark. The early responses matter, but the most recent ones weigh heavily because they're closest in memory. In meetings, this can shape decisions. A group discusses several options. The last person to speak often has the most influence, not always because their idea is best, but because it's the freshest. People remember it better. It feels more present. Earlier points fade unless someone brings them back. That gives the final voice more weight than it may deserve. Even in social settings, this plays a role. You meet someone at a party. They talk for a while. If the conversation ends with a funny story, that's what you remember. If it ends awkwardly, that becomes the impression. The final moment carries more weight than the rest. It's the last thing your brain holds onto. The recency effect is part of a larger idea known as the serial position effect. That's the tendency to remember the first and last items in a list better than those in the middle. The first items benefit from what's called the primacy effect. You rehearse them. You have more time to process them. The last items benefit from recency. They're still sitting in your working memory when you're asked to recall them. In advertising, this plays out clearly. Companies place their most important messages at the end of an ad. That's what they want you to remember. Call now. Limited time offer. Available at your local store. The ad builds up, but the closing line is what sticks. They know your brain is more likely to store the last part, even if you don't pay full attention. Movies use this too. A strong final scene can shape how people feel about the entire film. The ending colors the memory of everything that came before. If the final moments are powerful, people leave with that feeling. If the ending disappoints, it can make a good film seem worse in hindsight. The same is true in books. A story might unfold slowly, but a strong ending can make it memorable. Even in personal memory, the recency effect matters. Think about the last time you scrolled through photos on your phone. You probably spent more time looking at the newest ones. You may not have meant to ignore the old ones, but the fresh ones felt closer. They had more pull. Your mind went there first. This effect can shape relationships too. A friend may be kind to you for years, but if they're cold or distant during your last few interactions, that's what sticks. You remember the recent change, not the long history. That can feel unfair, but it's how memory works. The last impression carries more weight than the timeline as a whole. In sports, this changes how we judge performance. A player might have an average game, then score in the final minutes. That final move becomes the highlight. It defines the game in memory. The earlier plays fade. If they miss that last shot, the memory shifts again. People remember the failure, not the steady effort. Coaches and fans react based on what they saw last, not what happened throughout. In conversations, the recency effect shapes how arguments are received. If someone ends a speech with a strong closing line, people remember it. If they stumble or trail off, the ending weakens the rest. Listeners forget the points made earlier and judge based on the last sentence they heard. It even matters when we make lists. If someone tells you 5 things to do, you might remember the last 2 best. That can affect how you prioritize your tasks. Not because those tasks are more important, but because you remembered them more clearly. Unless you write them down, your brain may drop the middle steps and hold on to the ones at the end. This effect is not about being careless. It's built into how attention and memory work. The mind can only hold so much at once. The most recent information gets stored before the rest fades. That's not a flaw. It's how short-term memory protects what might be useful. You can work with this knowledge. If you want something to be remembered, put it at the end. If you're speaking, end with clarity. If you're teaching, close with the main point. If you're trying to make a strong impression, make sure your final moment matches what you want people to carry with them. You can also check your own memory. When you recall something, ask if you're giving too much weight to the last part. Are you forgetting what happened earlier? Are you judging based on how something ended, not how it unfolded? That question alone can bring more balance to how you remember events. The recency effect doesn't mean everything else gets erased. It just means that endings matter more than we think. the last line of a speech, the final scene in a film, the way someone signs off. Those are the pieces that stick, not because they're the best, but because they're still echoing in the space where memories you said into a weaker version then argues against that instead of your real point. It's a misrepresentation, not a response. The person avoids addressing what you actually said by replacing it with something easier to attack. This tactic gives the appearance of winning a debate, but the victory isn't real. It's built on knocking down a version of your argument that you never made. You might say, "I think we should invest more in mental health resources," and someone responds, "So you're saying we should just ignore physical health now?" That's not what you said. But now, instead of talking about mental health support, you're defending yourself against an accusation you never made. The conversation shifts. The original point disappears. You're stuck trying to explain that no, you don't want to ignore anything. You just wanted to add support where it's lacking. That's how the straw man works. It pulls attention away from the real issue and puts you on the defensive. Strawman arguments show up often in personal relationships. You express a need, and the other person reframes it into something more extreme. You say, "I'd like more time together," and they answer, "So now I'm a bad partner?" You didn't say that, but the conversation becomes about whether they're bad, not about how to make more time. You're no longer discussing solutions. You're managing someone else's reaction to something you never claimed. That shift makes your real concern harder to address. This tactic also appears during conflict. You say, "I felt hurt when you didn't return my call," and they reply, "So now I have to be available 24/7 to make you happy?" The exaggeration replaces your actual statement. It makes your feelings seem unreasonable. And once that distorted version is in the room, you end up arguing about that instead. You start defending yourself against a position you don't hold. You say, "That's not what I meant," but the damage is done. The focus has shifted. In friendships, straw man arguments often show up during boundary setting. You say, "I can't come out tonight, I need rest," and they respond, "Fine, I guess I'm just not important to you." Now the boundary has been replaced with rejection. You didn't say they weren't important, but you're left explaining yourself, reassuring them, justifying a simple choice. The original point, taking care of yourself, gets lost under the weight of what they made it mean. At work, this tactic gets used in group discussions or meetings. You offer a concern about a new process. You say, "I'm not sure this will work with our current schedule," and someone jumps in with, "So you're saying we should never try new things?" That exaggeration makes it sound like you're against progress, not pointing out a practical problem. It paints you as resistant, which shifts how others see your input. Instead of engaging with the concern, the person sidesteps it and paints you as unreasonable. Strawman arguments often come with emotional weight. They're designed to make you sound careless, extreme, or irrational. That makes them harder to respond to without looking defensive. You say, "I'm not comfortable with how that was handled," and someone replies, "So you think everyone involved was incompetent?" You never said that, but now you're stuck clarifying your tone and intent instead of discussing what went wrong. The person using the straw man gets to control the shape of the conversation. You get pulled off track. This tactic is also used in more subtle ways. Someone might repeat your words back to you with just enough change to twist the meaning. You say, "I'd like more support around the house," and they tell a friend, "She wants me to do everything." That shift from more support to everything changes how the message is received. It makes you sound demanding. And if others only hear that version, they may side with the person who distorted it. You're no longer seen as someone with a reasonable request. You're seen through the lens of their exaggeration. Strawman arguments work because they simplify. They reduce a complex idea into something flat and flawed. That makes it easier to refute. If someone can't or won't engage with your real point, they may resort to a straw man because it gives them an easy win. They don't have to think deeply or respond carefully. They just knock down the weaker version and call it a victory. Sometimes the person using this tactic doesn't do it on purpose. They may misunderstand what you said and respond to their version of it instead. But if they do it often, especially after you've clarified, it's no longer just misunderstanding. It's a pattern. It becomes a way to avoid accountability or control the conversation. And if you're on the receiving end, it can wear you down. You might start being overly cautious with your words, trying to head off any possible twist. You start anticipating how your words could be misused before you even speak. You may also notice that people who use strawman arguments often avoid follow-up questions. They rarely say, "Can you explain more?" or "Is that what you meant?" Instead, they jump to conclusions. They tell you what you believe instead of asking. That's part of how they keep control. If they can define your position, they don't have to respond to the real one. Over time, strawman arguments create confusion and distrust. You stop feeling like your voice is being heard. You explain yourself again and again, but the words keep getting reshaped. You argue over things you never said. You defend positions you don't hold. And the longer it goes on, the more disconnected you feel from the actual topic. You're not in a conversation. You're in a reaction loop. One of the clearest signs of this tactic is when your attempts to clarify are ignored or dismissed. You say, "That's not what I meant," and the person waves it off. Well, that's how it sounded. They keep attacking the version they built, not the one you actually shared. That refusal to engage with your real words shows that they're not interested in understanding. They're interested in winning or avoiding something they don't want to face. You don't have to argue with a straw man version of yourself. You can pause the conversation. You can say, "That's not what I said," and choose not to follow the thread they're pulling on. You can hold the line and restate your point clearly. You don't have to defend a version of your words that was never yours to begin with. Strawman arguments create noise. They build walls where there should be windows. But when you stop chasing the distortion, you can return to your real point and let that speak for itself. You're in a meeting. A senior manager shares an idea. It doesn't make much sense to you, but no one speaks up. Everyone nods. You do too. You assume they know something you don't. You don't question it. You trust the title. That's authority bias. It's the tendency to believe or agree with someone just because they hold a position of power. You assume they're more knowledgeable, more capable, or more right, often without checking the facts. You give their words more weight, even when the topic isn't their area of expertise. This happens often in the workplace. A leader makes a suggestion, and the team agrees. It doesn't matter if the suggestion is vague or impractical. The group trusts the role more than the reasoning. When authority bias is strong, bad ideas move forward because no one wants to push back. People assume if they're in charge, they must know best. It also shows up in medicine. A doctor gives a diagnosis, and the patient accepts it without asking questions. Even if something feels wrong, the patient stays quiet. They assume the doctor has better judgment. That trust can be helpful, but it also creates risk. A doctor can make mistakes. If no one speaks up or asks for a second opinion, those mistakes go unchecked. The Milgram experiment from the 1960s showed how strong this bias can be. Volunteers were told to give electric shocks to another person who was actually an actor. A man in a lab coat, playing the role of scientist, told them to continue even when the actor cried out in pain. Many participants kept going even when they thought they were hurting someone. They did it because the man in the lab coat told them to. He didn't threaten them. He didn't raise his voice. He just carried the look and tone of authority. That was enough. The title, the uniform, the badge, these things influence how people behave. In the presence of a doctor, a CEO, a professor, or a police officer, people often defer. They follow instructions, even if they feel unsure. They hold back questions, even when something doesn't add up. Authority shapes the conversation before it begins. In schools, students often accept what teachers say without checking. A teacher makes a claim and it enters the student's memory as fact. Later, if another source says something different, the student might still trust the teacher more. Not because the teacher explained better, but because they were the authority at the time. This bias shows up in small decisions too. You see a quote from a famous scientist, and you treat it like truth, even if the quote is about economics or education or something outside their field. You think, they're smart, they must be right. But expertise in one area doesn't transfer to all areas. A physicist might not know more about cooking than anyone else. A great athlete might not be a great coach. strong voice doesn't always mean strong reasoning. Authority bias also shows up in the news. A public figure makes a claim and it spreads fast. Reporters repeat it. Commentators analyze it. The audience assumes it must be true because of who said it. It takes longer for corrections to come. The original statement carries more weight, not because it's accurate, but because it came from someone powerful. You also see this in advertising. A company pays an actor to wear a white coat and talk about a product. They use medical language. They say clinically proven and recommended by professionals. The goal is to make you trust the message because it sounds like it's coming from someone with authority, even when it's not. The ad relies on appearance, not substance. In group settings, authority bias can silence dissent. A leader speaks first, and others hold back their views. They don't want to seem disloyal. They don't want to challenge someone above them. Even when they see a problem, they may wait to see if anyone else raises it. When no one does, the decision goes through. Not because it was solid, but because it came from the top. This also happens in families. A parent gives advice and the child follows it, even as an adult. The advice may be outdated or unhelpful, but the child trusts it because of who it came from. They don't question it until something forces them to. The bond of authority often outweighs the content of the message. The effect can be stronger in high-pressure settings. When time is short, people rely on cues. If someone in charge says, "Do this," it feels faster and safer to agree. The cost of questioning feels higher, but the risk of following blindly grows too. Decisions made under stress need clear thinking, not just titles. This bias isn't always wrong. Authority often comes with experience. A good manager may see things others don't. A skilled doctor may catch what others miss. But the problem isn't authority itself. It's the automatic trust. It's when people stop asking questions because they assume the leader must be right. The best authorities don't expect blind trust. They explain their reasoning. They welcome questions. They make room for doubt. They know that even good decisions benefit from being tested. The stronger the authority, the more responsibility they have to create space for others to speak. When authority bias goes unchecked, it can lead to mistakes that everyone sees too late. A company invests in a bad product because the CEO believed in it. A group follows a flawed plan because the leader insisted. A patient takes the wrong treatment because they didn't ask enough questions. These outcomes aren't caused by bad people. They're caused by a system that values power more than reasoning. You can notice authority bias by asking yourself a simple question. Would I believe this if someone else said it? If the same message came from a peer, would I question it more? If the answer is yes, then the weight you're giving the message may come more from who said it than from what they said. This doesn't mean ignoring experts. It means checking why you trust them. Is it their experience, their results, or just their title? Are they open to questions, or do they shut down disagreement? Do they speak clearly, or do they expect to be followed without explanation? These signs help separate true authority from the illusion of it. In the end, authority bias shows how easily roles shape our choices. A suit, a badge, a title. These things change how we listen. They change how we speak. But truth doesn't belong to any role. It stands on reason. And reason needs room, not just rank. When you remember that, you make better decisions, not just by following, but by thinking. You have an opinion. You believe it's reasonable. Maybe it's about politics, food, a sports team, or the best way to raise children. You go online and search for articles. You skim headlines, read posts, and click links. You notice that the ones you agree with feel right. You nod along. You share them. You feel more confident in your opinion. You stop looking at the rest. That's confirmation bias. It's the tendency to seek out, notice, and trust information that supports what you already believe, and to ignore, dismiss, or explain away anything that challenges it. You don't do it on purpose. It's automatic. It feels like critical thinking, but it's not. It's selective thinking dressed up as certainty. You can see this happen during debates. Two people argue about a topic. They both say they've done the research, but their sources don't overlap. One quotes a study that supports their view. The other quotes a different study that supports theirs. They're not changing their minds. They're reinforcing them. Each person came looking for support, and they found it. They didn't ask if it was strong evidence. They asked if it matched what they already thought. This bias is most powerful when you care about the issue. If something ties to your identity, your values, your background, your group, you want to protect that. Challenging it feels uncomfortable. So your brain starts working behind the scenes. It helps you spot the points that support your side. It helps you forget the ones that don't. It also shows up in how people interpret the same facts. Two people watch the same video clip. One sees a clear sign of guilt. The other sees proof of innocence. The difference isn't the footage, it's the lens each person brings with them. If they already believed something about the person in the video, they filter the footage through that belief. In news consumption, confirmation bias shows up in what people read and where they read it. Someone on one side of a political issue reads a news site that leans their way. They scroll past opposing viewpoints. If they read something that contradicts their view, they question the source or the motive behind it. They say this is biased or they have an agenda, but they don't apply the same scrutiny to sources they already agree with. Agreement feels like accuracy. This happens in science too. A researcher runs an experiment. They get results that don't match their hypothesis. They double-check the methods, look for errors, rerun the data. If the results do match, they move forward. The extra checking isn't dishonest, it's human. It's confirmation bias shaping how the evidence is treated. You can see this in hiring. A manager reads a resume and gets a good first impression. During the interview, they notice everything that supports that impression. The candidate says something clever, they mark it as a plus. If the candidate stumbles, they brush it off. But if the first impression was bad, the same answers might feel weak. The facts don't change, but the lens does. Even in relationships, this bias shows up. If you believe someone is thoughtful, you notice when they do kind things. You explain away the moments they're not. If you believe someone is selfish, you notice when they act that way and overlook their good moments. Your beliefs shape what you pay attention to. They become a filter. Confirmation bias doesn't just affect what you believe, it affects how you search. You type into a search engine, "Why is coffee good for you?" You don't search, "Is coffee bad for you?" You find studies about antioxidants and focus. You read them and feel good about your habit. But the way you asked the question shaped the answers you saw. You went looking for agreement and you found it. This also happens in memory. If you believe you're bad at public speaking, you remember the one time you froze on stage. You forget the other times that went fine. If you think someone dislikes you, you remember the awkward smile and forget the friendly comment. The belief sets the frame. The brain finds the pieces that fit inside it. In online discussions, confirmation bias keeps people in echo chambers. They follow accounts that reflect their views. They block or mute voices that don't. Over time, the feed gets more uniform. It feels like most people agree with them. The silence of opposing views creates a false sense of consensus. They don't see the bias, they just feel more confident. This is also why changing someone's mind is so difficult. When you give them facts, they don't always weigh them neutrally. They test them against what they already believe. If the facts match, they accept them. If they don't, they explain them away. They say, "That's not the whole story," or "That's one example." It's not that they refuse to think, it's that thinking is shaped by belief. The brain is not a neutral processor. It's a pattern-seeking machine. It wants coherence. It wants to reduce discomfort. When new information threatens a belief, the brain reacts. It questions the source. It picks at the details. It finds a way to make the belief and the new information fit together, or it rejects the new information altogether. People often say they're open-minded, but openness is harder than it sounds. It means asking, what would change my mind? It means reading things that make you uncomfortable. It means questioning your favorite sources. It means accepting that being wrong isn't a failure, it's part of learning. Confirmation bias is not a sign of stupidity. It's a sign of how the human brain protects what it believes. It works quietly. It feels like logic. It feels like fairness. But it bends reality just enough to make sure you stay confident in your view. And once it takes hold, it narrows what you see and how you see it. You can't erase this bias completely, but you can slow it down. You can notice when you only read one side. You can ask yourself why a different view feels wrong. You can check whether you would accept the same argument if it came from someone else. These small pauses don't fix the bias, but they create space. And in that space, you might hear something new, not just because it's said, but because you were ready to listen. Around you, you say you remember your uncle spilling juice on the carpet during your birthday party. Everyone laughs, except your uncle. He says he wasn't there that year. Your parents agree. They say he was out of town. You feel certain. You remember it. You picture it. But the event never happened. That's a false memory. It's the experience of recalling something that didn't occur, at least not the way you remember it. You're not lying. You're not trying to deceive anyone. You genuinely believe it's true. The image is clear in your mind. The details seem sharp, but the memory is wrong. Maybe it's a mix of two separate events. Maybe it came from a story someone told you. Maybe it formed around a photo you've seen many times. The brain doesn't flag it as false. It treats it like the rest of your memories. False memories can be small. You might remember putting your keys on the table, only to find them in your bag. You might think you sent an email and later realize you didn't. You picture the action. You recall the steps, but they didn't happen. The brain filled in the blank with something that felt right. They can also be large. People have remembered entire conversations that didn't take place. Some recall being in places they never visited. In more serious cases, people have confessed to crimes they didn't commit, based on memories that felt real but were false. That's how powerful memory can be. It doesn't need to be accurate to feel true. In one well-known study, researchers asked participants to recall childhood events. They gave each person short descriptions of 4 experiences. 3 were real, taken from family members. 1 was fake. It described the person getting lost in a shopping mall as a child. About a quarter of participants said they remembered the event. They added details, what the store looked like, who helped them, how they felt. The event never happened, but the mind created a memory to match the suggestion. This happens because memory isn't fixed. It's not a recording, it's a reconstruction. Each time you remember something, your brain rebuilds the scene. It fills in gaps with what makes sense. It pulls from images, words, feelings, and other memories. Most of the time, this works well, but sometimes it leads you away from what really happened. The source of a memory also gets blurred. You might hear a story from someone else and adopt it as your own. Maybe you saw it in a movie or read it in a book. Later, the edges fade and the story moves into your memory bank. It feels like something you lived. You don't question it because it's now part of your personal timeline. Photos and videos can also shape false memories. You see a picture of yourself as a child, holding a balloon at a park. You start to remember the day, the smell of popcorn, the sound of a nearby fountain. But maybe the photo was staged. Maybe the memories built around it came years later. Still, they feel real. The brain fills in what it believes should be there. False memories often form when you're trying to make sense of something. You misplace your wallet. You try to recall your steps. You remember putting it on the dresser, even though you didn't. The memory appears because your mind wants closure. It needs an explanation, so it builds one. That version feels complete, so you trust it. Group conversations can lead to shared false memories. A group of friends recalls a trip. One person says, "Remember when the tire blew out on the highway?" Others nod. Someone adds, "Yeah, it was raining too." Soon, the story gains detail. You remember feeling scared or sitting in the back seat. But maybe the tire never blew out. Maybe someone had told a similar story and the details got mixed together. The group shapes the memory and everyone accepts it. Stress can make false memories more likely. In tense moments, the brain doesn't process information the same way. It might miss things. It might misinterpret them. Later, when you try to recall what happened, the memory is shaky. You fill in the blanks without realizing it. The result is a confident but inaccurate account. Sleep plays a role too. When you dream, your brain moves pieces of memory around. It combines elements in strange ways. Sometimes, a dream can feel so real that you wake up believing it happened. You might remember a conversation from a dream as if it took place during the day. Over time, if you don't check the memory, it settles in as fact. This also explains why eyewitness testimony isn't always reliable. A person sees a crime and later tries to describe what happened. They believe they're telling the truth, but their memory may include errors, wrong clothing, wrong face, wrong sequence. If they saw a news report or spoke with someone else, their memory may have changed without their awareness. They don't mean to lie, they just don't know the memory has shifted. False memories don't always replace true ones. Sometimes they sit beside them. You might have two versions of the same event. One version feels clearer, so you trust it, but the other might be more accurate. You don't know which one is right. The memory feels real because it's vivid, not because it's correct. This effect doesn't make you unreliable. It makes you human. Everyone experiences false memories. They're not signs of weakness or failure. They're a product of how the brain works. It stores information in pieces. It edits, it rewrites, it fills in what's missing. That helps you function. It helps you learn and plan, but it also opens the door to mistakes. You can test your own memory. Think about a major event in your life. Try to describe it, then check your version against what others remember. Look at photos, journals, or recordings. You might be surprised by the gaps or by how certain details have changed. That doesn't mean your memory is bad. It means it's active. It's always updating. You can also watch how your memories shift over time. A story you told 5 years ago may sound different now. The order of events might change. The emotions might grow stronger. That's not because you're inventing things. It's because the act of remembering changes the memory. Each retelling is a chance for the brain to revise the file. Understanding false memory helps you approach your past with care. It reminds you that being confident doesn't mean being correct. It shows that memory is flexible, shaped by time, suggestion, and emotion. And a teacher walks into a classroom. She believes one of her students is gifted. She doesn't say it out loud, but her belief shows in small ways. She gives that student more time, more patience, and more encouragement. When the student struggles, she sees it as part of the process, not a sign of failure. She expects growth, and she acts accordingly. Over time, the student starts to perform better. He becomes more confident, more engaged, and more curious. The teacher's belief becomes the student's reality. That's the Pygmalion effect. It's the idea that higher expectations lead to better performance. When someone believes you can succeed, their actions reflect that belief. They push you a little harder. They give you more feedback. They don't give up on you quickly. You pick up on that. You start to believe it yourself. That belief shapes how you act, how you focus, and how you respond to setbacks. In the end, you do better, not just because of your ability, but because someone expected more from you. The term comes from a study in the 1960s by psychologists Robert Rosenthal and Lenore Jacobson. They told teachers that a few of their students were likely to show a sudden growth in intelligence that year. The names were chosen at random. The students weren't actually different from their peers, but the teachers didn't know that. They believed those students had special potential. By the end of the year, those students had improved more than others on IQ tests. Nothing had changed about the students themselves, just the expectations placed on them. This isn't magic. It's about behavior. A teacher who expects more might ask more questions, give more feedback, or offer more support. A manager who believes in a team member's skill might assign them bigger projects or trust them with harder tasks. A coach who sees an athlete's potential might give them more playing time or more direct instruction. Those actions shape the experience. They build skill, confidence, and motivation. You see this in workplaces. A supervisor thinks an employee has leadership potential. She gives him opportunities to lead small projects. She listens to his ideas. She gives honest feedback and expects improvement. The employee starts to step up. He becomes more confident in meetings. He takes more initiative. The supervisor's belief changes how she treats him, and that treatment changes how he sees himself. The same effect can show up in reverse. When expectations are low, performance can suffer. A teacher thinks a student isn't capable. She calls on him less often, gives less feedback, and lowers the bar. The student senses this. He stops trying as hard. He doesn't ask for help. Over time, he performs worse, not because he lacks ability, but because he picked up on low expectations. This is sometimes called the golem effect, the opposite of the Pygmalion effect. When others expect failure or poor performance, people often fulfill those expectations. the belief becomes a kind of ceiling. It limits how much effort a person gives and how much support they receive. Expectations are often communicated in subtle ways. A teacher might smile more often at students she believes in. She might lean in when they speak, show more patience when they struggle, and give more praise when they improve. A manager might assign better tasks, allow more autonomy, or give more detailed feedback to people he believes will succeed. These small cues add up. They shape the environment. They influence how people respond. It's not about empty praise or false hope. The Pygmalion effect doesn't say that belief alone creates results. It says that belief changes behavior, and behavior shapes outcomes. A teacher who believes in her students will invest more in them. A coach who expects an athlete to grow will train them harder and smarter. A parent who sees potential in a child will encourage more effort and celebrate progress more clearly. The expectation creates conditions where improvement is more likely. The effect can show up early. A young child hears that he's good at reading. He starts to believe it. He reads more, pays more attention, and tries harder. The belief becomes self-fulfilling. Another child hears that math isn't her strength. She backs away from it. She doesn't try as hard. She avoids challenge. That belief becomes her reality. Neither label may be accurate, but the expectation drives behavior, and the behavior drives performance. It also works in peer groups. A student tells a friend, "You're good at this," and the friend starts to act like it's true. A colleague says, "You always handle tough clients well," and that expectation shapes the next interaction. Beliefs don't live in a vacuum. They get reflected, passed on, and absorbed. Sometimes the person with potential is the last one to see it. The belief has to come from someone else first. The Pygmalion effect can also affect how people treat themselves. If you believe you're capable, you work differently. You stay with problems longer. You accept feedback instead of avoiding it. You take on challenges. If you believe you can't improve, you stop trying. You lower your effort to match your expectations. The belief becomes a ceiling or a ladder, depending on which way it points. In organizations, this effect can shape culture. If a workplace expects excellence, people tend to rise to meet that, not through fear or pressure, but through belief and support. Leaders who assume people want to grow will treat them like they can. That treatment creates the space and the challenge needed to grow. If the workplace expects mediocrity, people will often meet that too. They won't go beyond what's required. They won't take risks. They'll do enough to stay out of trouble, but not enough to stand out. Expectations define what feels possible. The Pygmalion effect isn't a trick or a shortcut. It doesn't replace skill, training, or effort. It works through those things. Belief doesn't create talent. It creates the environment where talent can show up. A person who is believed in is more likely to practice, to try again, to seek help, and to take pride in growth. The belief opens the door. The work still has to happen. The effect also depends on credibility. If someone you respect believes in you, you hear a song on the radio. At first, it doesn't stand out. The melody feels flat. The lyrics don't land. But after the third or fourth time, it sounds better. You start humming it. You add it to a playlist. You wouldn't have called it a favorite when you first heard it, but now it's familiar and you like it. That's the mere exposure effect. It's the idea that we tend to like things more just because we've seen or heard them before. It doesn't have to be a strong reaction at first. The key is repetition. When something becomes familiar, it starts to feel safer, easier, and more appealing. You don't need a reason to like it. Familiarity itself does the work. This effect shows up in everyday choices. You walk into a store to buy a snack. You see a brand you've never tried and one you recognize from ads. You pick the one you know. You might not even remember the ad clearly, but it planted the name and the look in your mind. That familiarity gives it a small advantage. It feels more trustworthy, even if you've never tasted it. In marketing, this happens all the time. Companies run the same commercials again and again. The goal isn't just to inform, it's to make the product feel familiar. When you finally decide to buy, you're more likely to choose the brand you've seen before. Not because you've compared it carefully, but because it feels known. The same effect shapes opinions. You see a face online, in the news, or on a poster. At first, you don't think much of it, but over time, the repetition adds weight. the face becomes easier to recognize. It feels more comfortable. You might even think the person looks more likable, even if nothing has changed. You've just seen them enough times for your brain to treat them as familiar. This also explains why certain ideas or phrases spread. A slogan or catchphrase doesn't have to be clever. It just has to be repeated. The more times you hear it, the more normal it feels. After a while, it becomes part of your thinking. You repeat it yourself, even if you don't fully agree. Familiar words feel smoother when you hear them. They don't sound as strange. That small shift in comfort can lead to acceptance. The mere exposure effect shows up in relationships too. You're more likely to become friends with people you see often. That's why classmates, coworkers, and neighbors often become close. You didn't plan it, you just saw them every day. That exposure made their presence feel familiar, and that familiarity made them easier to like. It works in dating as well. Someone might not stand out the first time you meet, but after a few more encounters, they start to feel more attractive. Not because they changed. Not because you learned something new. Just because your brain stopped treating them as a stranger. The repeated exposure builds a sense of ease. That ease turns into warmth. In school settings, students sometimes prefer teachers they've seen before, even if they haven't taken their class. Just walking past a familiar face in the hallway can create a mild sense of comfort. When the time comes to pick a class, that teacher feels like a safer choice. They may not know much about their teaching style, but they recognize the face. That's enough to sway the decision. This bias also affects how people react to new ideas. The first time someone hears a concept, they might resist it. It feels unfamiliar. It sounds odd. But if they keep hearing it from different people in different contexts, it starts to feel less strange. Eventually, they might accept it. Not because they changed their reasoning, but because the idea no longer feels foreign. The same thing happens with technology. When a new feature or device is introduced, people may avoid it. It feels unnecessary or confusing. But after a few demonstrations, ads, or conversations, the idea becomes more familiar. It starts to feel normal. People start to use it, not because it became better, but because they became more used to it. Even in art and music, this effect shapes taste. A painting might seem confusing the first time you see it. The shapes don't make sense. The colors feel strange. But after seeing it a few more times, it starts to grow on you. You begin to notice the structure, the balance, the details. The painting hasn't changed. Your brain has. What once felt strange now feels known. There's a reason why popular songs often sound familiar even on first listen. Many use similar chord progressions, rhythms, and melodies as earlier hits. The structure feels easy to follow. You don't need to work to understand it. That familiarity helps you connect, even if you've never heard the song before. It reminds you of something you already know. This also shows up in politics. A candidate who stays visible has an edge. They don't need to say more. They just need to be seen. People may not know their policies or background, but they recognize the name. In a crowded race, that alone can win votes. It doesn't guarantee approval, but it boosts comfort. People often choose what feels known over what feels new. You can see this effect in reverse too. When something unfamiliar appears, people often reject it without thinking. A new logo, a different layout, or a change in routine can feel wrong, not because it is, but because it doesn't match what you expect. Over time, those same changes become normal. What once felt wrong starts to feel right. The mere exposure effect doesn't require deep thinking. It works quietly. It shapes preference without asking for permission. That's why it's so effective. You don't stop and say, "I've seen this 5 times, so now I like it." You just feel more positive when it shows up. The brain mistakes ease for quality. When something feels easy to recognize, it also feels better. This can be useful. Repetition helps us learn names, faces, and patterns. It helps us adapt to change. But it also means we have to pay attention to why we like something. Do we like it because it's good, or just because it's familiar? That question isn't always easy to answer. The feeling of comfort is strong, but when you know where it comes from, you can choose whether to trust it or question it. You might think you like a product, a person, or an idea because you made an informed decision. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes you've just seen it enough times that your brain stopped resisting. The repeated exposure turned it from unfamiliar to familiar, and from unfamiliar to likable. It didn't need to be better. It just needed to be known. Someone asks you to repeat them, you say the first few and the last few. The ones in the middle are harder to remember. You're not alone. Most people do the same. This is the serial position effect. It describes how people tend to remember the first and last items in a sequence better than the ones in the middle. It works in all kinds of situations: lists, speeches, instructions, even daily conversations. You remember what came first because your brain had time to store it. You remember what came last because it's still fresh. The middle gets less attention and fades faster. The serial position effect includes two smaller effects: the primacy effect and the recency effect. The primacy effect is when you remember the early items best. These get rehearsed more. You hear the first word on a list, repeat it to yourself, and attach meaning to it. The brain gives it space in long-term memory. The recency effect is about the last items. These sit in short-term memory. You haven't had time to forget them yet. This shows up when someone gives you directions. They say, turn left at the gas station, go 3 blocks, past the school, turn right at the grocery store. Later, you remember the gas station and the grocery store. You forget what came in between. That's not because the middle steps were harder. It's because they got less attention in your memory. It happens during introductions. You meet 10 people at once. Later, you recall the names of the first 2 and the last one. The others blur together. If someone asks, "Who did you meet?" you talk about the ones from the beginning and end. You might recognize the others if you see them, but their names are harder to recall. That's the serial position effect at work. You see it in classrooms. A teacher gives a list of vocabulary words. On the test, students tend to remember the first few and the last few best. The ones from the middle get forgotten more often. That's why good teachers spread important terms throughout the lesson. They know the beginning and end will get more attention, so they try to balance where the key points land. This also explains how people respond to speeches or presentations. An audience is more likely to remember the opening and the closing. If the speaker starts strong and ends clearly, the talk seems better overall. A weak beginning or a flat ending can make a solid talk feel forgettable. Even if the middle was full of good content, it doesn't stick as well. That's why structure matters. What comes first and last shapes what stays in the mind. In job interviews, candidates often make a strong first impression. They dress well, speak clearly, and smile. Interviewers remember that. If the candidate also ends the interview on a confident note, they leave a strong final image. Even if the answers in the middle were average, the early and late moments weigh more. The serial position effect gives those parts more influence. In advertising, companies use this to place key messages at the start and end of commercials. They know those spots have more staying power. The middle might explain the product, but the first line grabs attention and the final line leaves a mark. Call now, limited time offer, only at your local store. These endings are short and easy to remember because they land right where memory holds on. Writers and content creators also think about this. They often start with a hook and end with a punch. The first line pulls you in. The last line helps you remember the message. If both are strong, the content feels complete. Even if the rest was average, people leave with what they heard last and what they heard first. Even in casual conversations, the effect shows up. You might leave a meeting or a party and remember how it started and how it ended. If the start was awkward and the end was fun, the memory tilts positive. If the start was warm and the end was tense, the whole event feels uneasy in hindsight. The middle gets less weight. This also plays a role in shopping. A customer sees a list of features for a product. They remember the first one because it started the list, and the last one because it finished it. If the strongest feature is buried in the middle, it might be overlooked. Marketers often place the most appealing benefits at the top or bottom of a list, not just for emphasis, but because that's where people's memory holds on. In legal settings, lawyers pay attention to this when they speak to juries. They open with a strong statement. They close with a clear summary. They know those parts will be remembered best. Even if they spend hours reviewing evidence, the jury's lasting impression will be be shaped by how the argument began and how it ended. The serial position effect helps guide how the story is told. This doesn't mean the middle never matters. It just means it's more likely to be forgotten unless it stands out. If something in the middle is emotional, surprising, or tied to a strong image, it can still be remembered. But under normal conditions, the middle items fall away first. The effect also shows up in how people recall their day. You might remember how it started: coffee, a delayed train, an early meeting. And you might remember how it ended: dinner with a friend, a phone call, a quiet moment. The hours in between blend together unless something stood out. You're left with bookends, not the full story. You can work with the serial position effect in practical ways. When giving instructions, repeat the important middle steps. When presenting information, return to key points more than once. When preparing for a speech, rehearse your opening and closing more carefully. Those parts will carry more weight. When learning something new, be aware that the start and end of a session will feel stronger in your mind. Space out the difficult material. Spread it across different times. Break long tasks into smaller chunks. That way, more parts get the benefit of being first or last. You can even use it in conversations. If you want someone to remember what you said, say it early, or say it just before you leave. If it's buried in the middle of a long talk, they might forget. But if it comes first or last, it sticks. The serial position effect is not a trick. It's part of how memory works. The brain doesn't treat every piece of information the same. It gives more attention to what comes in first and what stays at the end. You walk into a store and see a jacket priced at $300. You wouldn't pay that much, so you keep looking. Then you find a similar jacket for $150. It feels like a deal. You buy it. You didn't compare it to other stores. You didn't check what jackets usually cost. You judged it against the first price you saw. That first number stuck in your mind and shaped what came next. That's anchoring bias. It happens when the first piece of information you get becomes a reference point. Whether or not it's useful or fair, your mind treats it like a baseline. Everything after that gets compared to it. You don't do this on purpose. It happens automatically. The first number, idea, or claim acts like an anchor. It holds your thinking in place, even when you try to adjust. This effect is especially strong with numbers. In one study, researchers spun a wheel with numbers from 0 to 100. Then they asked participants to guess the percentage of African countries in the United Nations. The wheel was rigged. It landed on a low number for some people and a high number for others. Those who saw a low number gave lower estimates. Those who saw a high number gave higher ones. The number on the wheel had nothing to do with the question, but it influenced the answers. That's anchoring. It happens in negotiations. A seller asks for $10,000. The buyer thinks it's too high, so they offer $7,000. They meet in the middle. But what if the seller had started at $8,000? The deal might end around $7,500. The original number shapes the entire conversation. The first offer isn't just a starting point. It pulls the rest of the deal toward it. You see this when buying a car. The sticker price is $30,000. The salesperson drops it to $27,000. You feel like you're saving money, but maybe the fair price was $25,000 all along. You didn't check the market. You judged the discount based on the anchor. In salary talks, this bias plays out the same way. A job listing says $60,000. You negotiate and ask for $65,000. They offer $62,000. You take it, but maybe the role should pay $70,000. You anchored to the number they gave. That number shaped what you thought was reasonable. Anchoring doesn't only affect money, it changes how people judge other values too. You read a review that gives a movie 5 stars. Then you watch it and think it's pretty good. Not great, but not bad. Still, because of the review, you rate it higher than you would have if you went in cold. The first opinion set a tone. It works in courtrooms. A lawyer suggests a sentence of 10 years. The judge sees that as the frame, even if unconsciously. They might think 5 years is lenient, even if the crime doesn't call for that much time. That first number changed the range of options that seemed fair. Anchoring bias can even affect how we judge people. You hear someone is the smartest in the room before meeting them. You pay more attention to their comments. You give them the benefit of the doubt. You assume their ideas carry more weight. That label was the anchor. It shaped your impression before they said a word. The same thing happens in the opposite direction. You hear someone is difficult or unreliable. When they speak, you're less open. You question their motives. You see their behavior through a tinted lens. You anchored to a label instead of the actual interaction. This effect also shows up in self-judgment. You tell yourself, "I'm not good at math." That becomes your anchor. When you do well on a test, you think it was luck. When you struggle, it proves your belief. The first claim shapes the rest of your thinking. You judge each moment through the lens of the anchor. Even numbers that seem random can influence choices. In one study, people were asked the last 2 digits of their social security number. Then they were asked how much they would pay for a bottle of wine. People with higher numbers gave higher bids. The digits had no connection to wine prices, but the brain used them as anchors anyway. Anchoring bias sticks because the brain likes shortcuts. It wants to make decisions quickly. When it gets a number or label, it latches on. It adjusts from there, but not far enough. The adjustment is often small, and the final judgment stays close to the anchor. You might think you're immune if you know the anchor is arbitrary, but the effect still works. People who were told the anchor was random still let it influence their answers. Awareness alone doesn't cancel it out. That's what makes anchoring powerful and quiet. It's not just the first number you hear. Sometimes it's the first story, the first image, or the first assumption. That first piece of input can pull everything else toward it. It frames the situation. It narrows the range of what feels normal, fair, or acceptable. In marketing, this is used on purpose. A product is listed at $100 but on sale for $60. The anchor makes $60 feel like a bargain. The $100 price may be inflated or rarely charged, but it sets the comparison point. That changes how you feel about the deal. In fundraising, the same trick works. A charity asks you to give $500. You don't have that much, so you give $100. But if they had asked for $100 first, you might have given $50. The first number shapes what follows. It redefines what feels generous. Anchoring also affects planning. You set a goal to write 2,000 words a day. That becomes your anchor. On a slow day, you reach 1,200 and feel like you fell short. But if your anchor had been 1,000, that same day would feel like progress. The goal shaped the scale you use to measure your own work. You can see the anchor when you compare timelines. You hear someone finished a task in 3 days. You set that as your frame. When it takes you 5, you feel slow, but maybe 5 days was reasonable. The first number pulled your expectations away from what actually makes sense. To spot anchoring, watch how your thinking starts. Ask where your first number came from. Ask if the label or judgment you started with is reliable. If it came from another person, ask whether they had reasons to pick that number, or if they were anchoring you on purpose. Anchoring bias doesn't mean your final decision is always wrong. It just means your first impression shaped more of your thinking than it should have. The starting point took up more space than it deserved. You adjusted, but not enough. You're walking down a busy street. You hear someone shout for help. You look around and see dozens of people nearby. Some glance over, most keep walking. You hesitate. You assume someone else will step in, but no one does. The person keeps shouting, but the crowd moves along. That's the bystander effect. It's the tendency for people to be less likely to help when others are present. The more people around, the less each individual feels responsible. Everyone sees the same thing. Everyone assumes someone else will act. The result is that no one acts. This effect was first studied after a case in New York City in the 1960s. A woman named Kitty Genovese was attacked near her apartment. Reports at the time said that dozens of people heard or saw parts of the attack but didn't intervene. Later reports showed the story was more complicated, but the event sparked research into how people behave in groups during emergencies. Psychologists wanted to know why no one helped. They found that the presence of others changes how people think. When you're alone and you see someone in trouble, you feel responsible. You either help or choose not to, but you know the decision is yours. When you're in a group, that feeling spreads out. You think someone else will handle it. everyone else thinks the same. Responsibility is divided so thin that it feels like it disappears. This plays out in small situations too. A man drops his papers in a crowded hallway. People step around him. A woman trips on the sidewalk in a busy square. Others glance over, then look away. If just one person had been there, they might have helped. But in a group, the urge to act gets weaker. You look to others for cues. If no one moves, you take that as a sign that it's not urgent. You trust the group, even when the group is silent. This is called pluralistic ignorance. Everyone in the group may feel unsure or worried, but no one shows it. They don't want to overreact or stand out, so they act calm. That calm gets mirrored back. The situation looks under control, even when it's not. In experiments, this effect shows up clearly. In one study, participants sat in a room that's slowly filled with smoke. Some were alone. Some were with two other people who were told to ignore the smoke. The people who were alone were more likely to report it. The ones with passive actors often stayed put. They saw the smoke. They sensed something was wrong, but they didn't want to look foolish. If the others weren't reacting, they didn't either. Another study staged a fake emergency where someone called out for help. When participants were alone, most got up and looked for the person. When they were in a group, fewer moved. They hesitated. They looked around. They waited. Some even said later that they thought it was serious, but assumed someone else would step in. The bystander effect doesn't mean people don't care. It means the situation makes caring harder to act on. Uncertainty, social pressure, and diffusion of responsibility all push people toward inaction. They don't ignore the problem, they just freeze. The effect can be stronger in unfamiliar places. In your own neighborhood, you might know what to do or who to call. In a new city or building, you look for social cues. You check how others are reacting. If no one moves, you don't either. The group becomes a guide, even when the guide is silent. Social roles also matter. If you think someone else is more qualified, like a security guard or manager, you're even less likely to act. You defer to the perceived authority. You assume they've seen the problem and chosen how to handle it, but sometimes they haven't seen it. Sometimes they're deferring too. The bystander effect doesn't only apply to emergencies. It shows up in classrooms, offices, and meetings. A student makes an inappropriate comment. No one reacts. Some people are uncomfortable, but no one speaks up. Each person thinks someone else should. The silence makes it seem like everyone agrees or no one minds. At work, someone is treated unfairly. Others notice, but stay quiet. They worry it's not their place or that they might face pushback. The more people who witness it, the less likely it is that any one person will step forward. Everyone waits, everyone hesitates, but the effect can be broken. In many cases, once one person steps in, others follow. They just needed someone to move first. That first action changes the tone. It shows that it's okay to respond. It pulls the group out of inaction. You can also reduce the effect by assigning responsibility. Instead of saying, "Someone call 911," you point to a person and say, "You call 911." When people feel like they've been chosen, they're more likely to act. Vague calls for help often go unanswered. Clear direction cuts through the uncertainty. Knowing about the bystander effect also helps. When you recognize what's happening, you can override it. You can tell yourself, everyone else is probably thinking the same thing I am. That reminder shifts the responsibility back onto you. It doesn't make the decision easier, but it makes it clearer. You don't need to be the strongest or smartest person in the room to take action. Often, you just need to be the first one to move. That small step, checking on someone, asking a question, making a call, can break the stillness of the crowd. Others will follow your lead. They weren't unwilling. They were waiting for a signal. The bystander effect is a product of group dynamics, not personal failure. It shows how people take cues from each other and how silence can become a kind of permission. You watch a football game. One team wins in the last few minutes. You turn to your friend and say, "I knew they were going to win." But if someone had asked you halfway through, you weren't sure. You were just watching the game. You weren't calling outcomes. Still, now that it's over, it feels obvious. That's hindsight bias. It's the feeling that you knew it all along after something happens. It doesn't matter if you made a real prediction. Once you know the outcome, your memory reshapes itself. You believe the result was more predictable than it actually was. The surprise fades. The ending seems logical, even if it wasn't at the time. This shows up in everyday situations. You get a test result back, good or bad. Suddenly the outcome feels expected. If it's good, you say, I studied hard. Of course I did well. If it's bad, you say, I had a feeling something was off. But before the result came in, you weren't sure. You had guesses, not certainty. After the fact, your brain smooths over that doubt. You see this in investing. A stock drops sharply. People say, you could see this coming. They point to signs they ignored earlier. They treat them like warnings they had understood. But during the rise, those same signs were explained away or missed. Once the loss happens, it feels like the risk was obvious, but it wasn't. The feeling of foresight only comes after the fact. Hindsight bias also plays out in news and politics. After an election, people say the result made sense. They look back at the polls, the debates, the turnout numbers. They say it was all there. But before the result, the same people were unsure. They were reading different polls, guessing different outcomes. Once the winner is clear, the brain rewrites the story to make it seem inevitable. This bias isn't about lying. It's not about bragging. It's about how memory works. The brain doesn't store raw facts. It stores stories. When something new happens, the story changes. The earlier uncertainty fades. The new version feels smooth and clear. You don't remember how unsure you were. You just remember the ending and assume you saw it coming. It happens in sports all the time. A coach makes a risky decision. If it works, people say it was smart. You could see it was the right call. If it fails, they say it was reckless. Anyone could have seen that wouldn't work. The same choice judged by the outcome. The decision didn't change, but our view of it did, because now we know what happened. That's the trap of hindsight bias. It makes people overconfident. They think they can predict outcomes better than they can. They think past success was based on skill instead of chance. They ignore how uncertain the moment actually was. That makes them take bigger risks the next time, thinking they understand more than they do. You can also see this effect in relationships. A breakup happens. Friends say, I saw it coming. They remember the fights, the small problems, the signs. They forget the times when everything seemed fine. They forget that before the breakup, they didn't say anything. But after the fact, the story is rewritten to fit the result. The new version seems obvious. The same happens when people succeed. A person starts a business and it grows fast. Others say, you could tell they were going to make it. They remember the confidence, the hard work, the early wins. They forget the risk. They forget how unsure it looked at the beginning. Once success is clear, it feels like it was always going to happen. This shows up in the classroom too. A teacher gives a test. One question tricks most students. After the answer is revealed, students say, oh, I knew that. But if they really did, they would have answered it correctly. What they mean is that the answer makes sense now. It fits. But fitting after the fact isn't the same as predicting before. You see it in hiring decisions. A manager hires someone who turns out to be a poor fit. Other team members say, I had a feeling about that guy. They remember a strange comment in the interview. They forget that they didn't mention it before. Now the story makes sense. But that doesn't mean it was predictable. It just feels that way in hindsight. In safety and risk management, hindsight bias can lead to blame. After an accident, investigators look for what went wrong. If a mistake is found, people say, they should have seen that coming. But before the accident, the same warning sign might have looked like part of normal operations. After the damage, the signs feel clearer than they were. This creates problems in learning. If people believe they saw something coming, they stop looking at why they didn't act. They miss the chance to understand the warning signs in real time. They don't improve their decision-making, they just feel more certain the next time. Even in personal life, this bias shows up. A friend tells you about a breakup, a job loss, or a health scare. You say, I always had a feeling. But feelings aren't predictions. They're vague. They don't mean you knew. But hindsight makes you feel like you did. To avoid this bias, you have to remember how you actually felt before the outcome. Were you unsure? Did you think the opposite might happen? Did you weigh different options? Write things down if you can. If you track your thoughts before results come in, you can check how accurate your memory is later. That helps you see how often hindsight smooths out the rough edges. This bias isn't a flaw, it's a shortcut. The brain wants stories that make sense. Once the ending is clear, the brain fills in the gaps. It builds a clean narrative. But real life is messier. Outcomes aren't always obvious. Decisions aren't always clear. The world has more chance in it than we want to admit. Recognizing hindsight bias doesn't mean ignoring what you learn. It means asking how much of what you knew came after the fact. It means accepting that the future is never as predictable as it feels in the past. What seems obvious now probably wasn't then. What feels like foresight might just be memory, cleaned up and rewritten into a room wearing a blue shirt. In the next shot, the shirt is green. You don't notice. You're following the story, not the shirt. Later, someone points it out, and you're surprised. It was right there. The color changed, and your eyes were open the whole time, but you missed it. That's change blindness. It's the failure to notice a change in a visual scene, even when it's large or obvious. It happens because attention is limited. You don't see everything. You see what you focus on. The rest becomes background. When that background changes, you often don't notice, especially if the change happens during a distraction or interruption. Your brain fills in the gap without checking for updates. Researchers have tested this in simple ways. One experiment used two nearly identical images. The only difference was something like a building missing from the background or an object changing color. The two images flashed back and forth with a blank screen in between. People struggled to spot the change. Even when told that something had changed, they had to search for it. Without the blank screen, the change was easier to see. But with that short pause, the brain treated the two scenes as separate. It didn't compare them closely. That short pause breaks the link. Your brain doesn't think, let me check if anything changed. It thinks, this looks familiar. Familiarity means safety. Safety means no need to scan for updates, so you miss the switch, even when it's big. This also works in real life. A researcher stops someone on the street to ask for directions. While they're talking, two people walk between them carrying a large board. The person behind the board switches places with the original speaker. The new person looks similar, same clothes, same general build, but is clearly a different person. Still, many people don't notice. They keep giving directions. Their focus was on the task, not the person. Their brain assumed nothing important had changed. Change blindness shows up in meetings, in classrooms, in conversations. A slide changes during a presentation. A diagram is altered. A person's tone shifts. If you're focused on the big idea or your own thoughts, you might miss it. You're not ignoring the change. You're just not watching for it. Your attention is already somewhere else. This explains why eyewitnesses can disagree. Two people see the same event, but remember it differently. One says the person wore a hat. The other doesn't remember a hat at all. Neither is lying. One focused on the face, the other didn't. The brain didn't log every detail, it captured what felt relevant. If the hat changed or disappeared during the scene, it may not register. In driving, change blindness can be dangerous. A driver looks both ways, sees no one, and pulls out. But a motorcycle was approaching. It wasn't invisible, it just wasn't noticed. The driver's brain saw a clear road and moved on. The small size and speed of the motorcycle made it easier to miss. This isn't about carelessness. It's about the limits of attention. When the scene looks stable, the brain doesn't scan for change. Change blindness also affects how people process information. You might read a document with two versions of a paragraph. The second version changes a keyword or number. If the format looks the same, you may not spot the difference. You assume it's a repeat. Your brain fills in the meaning from memory instead of reading closely. This happens in film editing. A character's drink level changes from one shot to the next. A scarf disappears and comes back. These mistakes are called continuity errors. Viewers often don't notice unless they're looking for them. The brain focuses on faces, dialogue, and movement. Small background details go unnoticed. Even big changes slip past if they're not tied to the main action. In conversations, change blindness can shape how we respond. A person's body language shifts. Their energy drops. Their answers become shorter. If you're thinking about what to say next, you might miss it. The conversation feels the same, but something important has changed. Later, you realize they were upset or distracted. The signs were there, but your focus was somewhere else. In design and user interfaces, change blindness is a known challenge. A button moves, a color shifts, a new feature appears. If users don't notice, they keep acting like nothing changed. Designers try to draw attention with animation or contrast, but people still miss things. Familiarity creates a kind of blindness. If the page looks mostly the same, the brain assumes it is the same. This effect can also shape how people interpret behavior. Someone you know well starts acting differently. They respond slower. They cancel plans more often. You don't notice right away. The change is gradual. Your brain keeps updating the image without flagging the shift. One day, you realize they're not acting like themselves. But the signs started earlier. You just didn't see them. The pattern changed slowly, and your focus stayed on the bigger picture. Even in safety systems, this effect matters. A warning light might come on during a routine task. If you've seen that panel many times, you may not register the change. Your brain fills in the usual scene. The warning is there, but it doesn't trigger attention. That's why critical changes often come with sound or movement. The system tries to break your focus and pull you into the moment. Change blindness reminds us that seeing is not the same as noticing. Your eyes might land on something, but your brain filters it out. Attention chooses what gets processed. Everything else becomes background. If that background shifts while your attention is elsewhere, you miss it. This doesn't mean people are unaware. It means awareness is limited. You don't scan for change unless you expect it. You trust stability. You assume the world is mostly staying the same. That assumption works most of the time. But when something shifts and you miss it, you don't know you missed it. The scene keeps playing, and your brain keeps filling in the blanks. It's easy to say, I would have noticed that. But noticing takes effort. It takes attention. And attention is selective. It zooms in on one thing and leaves out the rest. That's why two people can walk through the same room and see different things. One notices the furniture, the other sees the lighting. The third doesn't notice anything changing at all. To spot change blindness, you have to expect it. You have to ask what might be different. You have to slow down and look again. It doesn't mean you meet someone who's just started playing chess. After a few online matches, they begin explaining strategy like an expert. They talk about openings, endgames, and famous players. They say things like, I've pretty much figured this game out. But when you play against them, you see mistakes on every move. They're confident, but their understanding is shallow. That's the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's the idea that people with low ability in a task often overestimate their skill. They don't know enough to see their mistakes. They think they're doing well because they don't know what doing well really looks like. Without a clear sense of the full picture, their confidence stays high. The gap between what they know and what they think they know can be wide. This effect shows up in many areas. A new cook watches a few recipe videos and thinks they can handle a holiday meal for 10 people. They don't notice how much timing, planning, and problem-solving goes into it. When things fall apart, undercooked meat, cold sides, burnt rolls, they're surprised. They thought they had it covered. In school, a student might do well on a few practice problems and assume they understand the material. Then the test comes, and they realize the questions are harder than they expected. They didn't see the gaps in their knowledge because they didn't know what questions to ask. They felt prepared, but they weren't. The Dunning-Kruger effect doesn't mean everyone who's new is arrogant. It means that when someone is inexperienced, they often lack the tools to measure their ability. They don't know the standards. They don't see the layers. They judge themselves based on what they can do, not on what they don't yet understand. This was first shown in a study by psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger. They tested people on grammar, logic, and humor. Then they asked the participants to rate how well they thought they did. The people who scored the lowest often gave themselves the highest self-assessments. They didn't just miss the mark, they didn't know they missed it. The same people also had trouble recognizing strong performance in others. Their understanding was too limited to see where they fell short. It wasn't just a confidence problem. It was a problem with self-awareness. They couldn't step back and see how their skills compared to the bigger picture. This happens in the workplace. Someone who just joined a team might speak with great certainty. They make bold suggestions in meetings, challenge processes, and question leadership decisions. They haven't seen the long-term challenges. They haven't handled setbacks. Their confidence comes not from experience, but from a lack of experience. You also see this in technical fields. A person watches a few videos on cryptocurrency and suddenly calls themselves a financial expert. They start giving advice to others. They use terms they barely understand. They don't see the risk because they haven't lived through a downturn. The tools for measuring expertise are missing, so the belief in their skill remains high. The Dunning-Kruger effect isn't about being unintelligent. It's about not yet knowing enough to understand what you don't know. It's a gap in awareness. When you learn more, your confidence usually dips. You start to see the depth of the subject. You realize how much you still have to learn. That's a healthy sign. It means your judgment is catching up to your skill. This also explains why experts can sound unsure. Someone with years of experience often uses careful language. They say, "It depends," or "There's more to it," or "I'm not sure yet." They know how complex things are. They've made mistakes. They've seen edge cases. Their confidence is steady, but it comes with caution. A beginner might hear that and think, they're not confident. They must not know what they're doing. But that's backwards. The cautious person is often the one who truly understands the subject. The person who sounds most sure might be the least informed. This gap between confidence and competence creates problems. It can lead to bad decisions, poor advice, and a lack of learning. If someone believes they're already skilled, they don't ask questions. They don't listen to feedback. They don't look for mentors. Their growth stalls because they think they've already arrived. The internet has made this more visible. People can learn a little and speak loudly. They write long posts, they make videos, they argue in comment sections. The volume of their voice doesn't match the depth of their knowledge. But because confidence often looks like competence, others believe them. The cycle spreads. You also see the opposite side. People with real skill may understate what they know. They assume that others already understand what they do. They don't realize that their knowledge is advanced. They remember how long it took to learn and assume others must have walked the same path. So they speak quietly while the least skilled speak the loudest. That imbalance can shape perception. A room may follow the confident voice, not the accurate one. A group may take advice from someone who's wrong but sure of themselves. That's why the Dunning-Kruger effect matters. It's not just a personal bias, it has social consequences. It affects hiring, leadership, training, and public trust. If someone overestimates their skill, they might push ahead in situations where they should step back. If others assume confidence means ability, they might put the wrong person in charge. This effect can also block learning. If someone does something wrong but thinks it went well, they don't improve. They don't reflect. They move forward with the same mistake. The feedback loop is broken. They don't seek correction because they don't believe they need it. You can spot the Dunning-Kruger effect in yourself by asking how you respond to difficulty. If something seems easy right away, ask whether you've really tested your understanding. If you think you're better than others after only a short time, ask whether you've seen the full range of the skill. If you never seek feedback, you walk into a room and suddenly remember what you were trying to recall earlier. You couldn't think of it at your desk. But now, standing in the kitchen, it comes back. You weren't trying harder. The thought just returned, almost on its own. That's context-dependent memory. It's the idea that people remember information better when they're in the same place or situation where they first learned it. The environment becomes a kind of cue. When you return to that place, the memory comes with it. The setting helps your brain unlock what it stored earlier. This was tested in a study with scuba divers. One group learned a list of words underwater. Another learned the same list on land. Later, both groups were asked to recall the words, some in the same place where they learned, others in the opposite setting. The results were clear. Divers remembered more when tested in the same environment where they studied. Those who learned underwater did better underwater. Those who learned on land did better on land. The location itself helped trigger the memory. This happens because the brain connects information with what's going on around you. When you learn something, you don't just store the facts, you also store the sights, sounds, smells, and feelings in that moment. Later, those background details can act as prompts. They remind your brain where to look. You see this in classrooms. A student studies in a quiet library and remembers the material well. But during the exam, in a noisy classroom, they freeze. The facts are in their mind, but the cues are missing. If they went back to the library, the answers might come easier. The change in setting breaks the connection. It's not that they didn't learn, it's that the retrieval path is harder to find. Context-dependent memory works with more than just location. It also includes mood, posture, lighting, background noise, and even time of day. If you always study late at night, your brain may link that time with learning. If the test happens early in the morning, the rhythm feels off. You're in a different state. The change makes recall harder. Smell can be a powerful cue. You smell something familiar, fresh grass, a certain kind of soap, old books, and it brings back a memory. You weren't trying to remember. The scent did the work. Your brain stored the smell with the experience. When it comes back, so does the memory. That's context helping the recall. Music can do the same thing. You hear a song that played during a trip and the whole moment returns. You remember the weather, the conversation, the feeling. You didn't practice remembering. The song just unlocked the file. The tune was part of the original scene, and your brain used it to rebuild the past. You also see this effect in routines. A person always parks in the same spot at work. One day they park somewhere else. After work, they walk to their usual space and feel confused when the car isn't there. They forgot they parked differently because the routine was broken. Their memory for the change didn't stand out. The habit was tied to a certain location, and the context helped them remember where to go. This bias can cause problems during learning. If you only study in one place, your recall may depend too much on that setting. You do well at your desk, but struggle elsewhere. To avoid that, it helps to study in different environments. Each new setting builds different cues. The memory becomes stronger and less tied to a single spot. Students who review material in different places often recall it better later. The brain builds more paths to the same information. It's not just about repetition, it's about variety. New contexts create more ways to access the memory. Context-dependent memory also plays a role in interviews. You rehearse answers at home and feel confident. But at the interview table, under pressure, your mind goes blank. It's not that you didn't prepare, it's that your preparation happened in a calm space, maybe seated in sweatpants. Now you're dressed differently in a new room with someone watching you. The context has shifted and the cues are gone. People working with witnesses know this effect well. Police might return a person to the scene of a crime to trigger memory. The location may help them remember details they didn't recall at the station. The sights and sounds create a mental connection that brings forgotten information to the surface. Writers experience this when they draft in one place and try to revise in another. A sentence that made sense at night doesn't work in the morning. A section that felt strong at a cafe falls flat at home. Sometimes it's not the words that changed, it's the setting. The memory of what you meant can be clearer when you go back to where you wrote it. The same thing happens with conversations. You remember what you wanted to say, but only once the moment passes. You think, I wish I'd thought of that earlier. Then, hours later, sitting in the same chair or walking the same path, the words come back. The setting gives your brain a reminder, even though it's too late to use it. This kind of memory shows how tightly we link information to the world around us. We think we store ideas in neat mental folders, but those folders are often tied to where we were, what we saw, and how we felt. When you go back to the same spot, the folder opens more easily. This also explains why certain memories are hard to recall until you return to the place where they happened. A visit to an old school or neighborhood brings back thoughts you hadn't touched in years. The hallways, the sounds, even the light bring it all back. You didn't forget the past, you just didn't have the right prompt until then. In therapy, context matters too. A person may feel progress in a calm office, but when they return to the setting where stress or conflict happens, they struggle to apply what they've learned. The calm room gave them one set of tools. The stressful environment gives them another. Unless they've practiced both, the memory may not carry over. Understanding context-dependent memory helps explain why people forget things they actually know. It's not always a failure of learning. It's often a matter of retrieval. The knowledge is there, but the key to unlock it is missing. If the environment shifts, the key doesn't fit. It also shows how we can improve recall by using cues on purpose. Recreate the testing environment while you study. Sit at a similar desk. Use the same lighting. Practice aloud if the test will be spoken. If you'll take the test in silence, review and you go to the dentist. The visit lasts 30 minutes. Most of it is routine, just scraping, rinsing, and checking. But at one point, the hygienist hits a nerve. It hurts enough to make you flinch. Then, near the end, she slows down, softens her touch, and talks you through the last few minutes. When you leave, you say it wasn't too bad. You don't average the pain. You remember the worst moment and how it ended. That's the peak end rule. It's the idea that people judge past experiences based not on the total sum of the event, but on two key parts, the most intense point and the final part. Your memory doesn't track every minute evenly. It highlights the high point, good or bad, and the way things ended. The rest gets blurred or dropped. Researchers showed this in a study with cold water. Participants put their hand in icy water, just above freezing, for 60 seconds. Then, in a second round, they kept their hand in the same cold water for 60 seconds, but afterwards stayed for an extra 30 seconds while the temperature was raised slightly. The second trial was longer and involved more total discomfort, but when asked which round they preferred, many chose the second one. It ended on a less painful note. The final minutes softened the memory of the whole event. The peak end rule shaped how they judged the experience. This shows up in customer service. You wait a long time on hold. The music repeats, the delay drags on. But when the agent finally answers, they're helpful, calm, and kind. They fix the issue quickly. You hang up and feel okay about the call. The wait was annoying, but it didn't define the experience. The helpful ending did. If the agent had been rude or unhelpful, the whole thing would have felt worse, even if the wait had been shorter. Vacations work the same way. A trip can have long stretches of average time, waiting in lines, riding buses, or walking between sites. But if you have one great moment, like standing on a mountaintop or seeing a beautiful sunset, and the trip ends on a smooth note, maybe a great dinner or an easy flight, you look back on it as a great trip. The small annoyances fade. Your memory grabs the high point and the ending and uses those to summarize the whole experience. The same thing happens in entertainment. A movie might start slow and drag in the middle, but if it has one powerful scene and ends well, people walk out satisfied. They say it was a good movie. They don't calculate the boring stretches. They hold on to the scene that hit hard and how the story wrapped up. If the final scene is flat or confusing, even a strong beginning can be forgotten. The ending shapes how people feel about the whole thing. This rule also explains why endings matter in relationships. A breakup can shape how you remember the entire relationship. Even if most of it was calm or good, a painful end can take over the memory. It becomes the peak. The last arguments, the silence, the final words, those moments can stand in for months or years of other experiences. If the relationship ends with care, respect, or closure, the memory might stay warm, even if it had problems. You can see this effect in performances. A speech, concert, or show might go well for a long time, but if it ends awkwardly, that's what people remember. A fumbled line, a missed note, or a rushed close can leave a lasting impression. The opposite is true too. A slow start followed by a strong finish can turn an average performance into a memorable one. This bias doesn't just shape how we judge the past, it also affects future choices. If you remember a doctor's visit as painful because of one sharp moment and a cold goodbye, you might avoid going back, even if most of the visit was fine. If your last workout ended on a low note, you might skip the gym the next day. Your decisions aren't based on a full record. They're based on the parts your memory flagged as important. The peak end rule affects how people review products and services. A customer might have used a product for months without issues, but one bad experience, a broken feature or poor support, followed by a weak resolution, can lead to a negative review. The overall experience didn't change, but the ending did. On the other hand, a company can recover from a rough start if they fix the problem well. People will often say they handled it quickly or they made it right, and that becomes the takeaway. In healthcare, this effect shapes patient satisfaction. A hospital stay might involve pain, waiting, and discomfort. But if the staff are kind at discharge, if the paperwork is smooth, and if the patient feels heard on the way out, they often report higher satisfaction. The final part of the experience colors the whole memory. This also shows up in education. A semester might feel long and repetitive, but one good project or strong feedback near the end can shift a student's whole view of the class. If the last few weeks feel rewarding, the student might say it was a good class, even if they struggled early on. A difficult course that ends with support can leave a stronger impression than an easy course that ends in silence. You also see the peak-end rule in personal milestones. A birthday party might have slow parts, awkward guests, or late arrivals. But if one moment felt joyful, a shared laugh, a toast, a surprise, and if the night ended on a positive note, that's what gets remembered. The event becomes a good memory, not because it was perfect, but because the highlights were strong and the ending felt right. The rule plays out in conflict as well. An argument may involve many points, raised voices, and long pauses. But if it ends with resolution, honesty, or even a hug, it feels different. The memory of the fight becomes softer. If it ends in anger or distance, the same conflict feels worse. It lingers longer. The brain uses the ending to file the experience. This rule doesn't track fairness. A 10-minute event with one bad minute and a kind farewell might feel better than a longer, mostly pleasant experience that ends poorly. Our brains don't average the time. They select highlights. They assign weight to moments that stood out. That means short but intense events can sometimes have more impact than long, even ones. The peak-end rule helps explain why some memories feel sharp while others fade. It's not always the length or the content. It's the structure. You ask a group of drivers how good they are behind the wheel. Most of them say they're above average. Some say they're in the top 10%. A few say they're better than almost everyone else. The numbers don't work. Everyone can't be better than everyone else. Still, they believe it. That's illusory superiority. It's the tendency to overestimate your own abilities, especially in comparison to others. You think you're smarter, more capable, more fair, or more skilled than the average person. So does almost everyone else. This bias shows up across jobs, hobbies, school subjects, and even personal traits like honesty and kindness. People think they're better than most, even when there's no evidence, or when the evidence says otherwise. In one study, researchers asked college professors to rate their teaching. 94% said they were above average. That's not possible. If most people are above average, the definition of average breaks down. But each person used their own standards. They thought about their strengths and ignored their weaknesses. They assumed other people made more mistakes than they did. The bias wasn't malicious. It was just built in. Students show this too. Many believe they're better than their classmates, even in subjects where they struggle. If you ask students to rate their performance before a test, most expect to score higher than the class average, but the scores usually fall in a normal range. Some do well, some don't. The class can't all be above the line they drew in their minds. This effect plays out in friendships. If you ask people how good they are at listening, most say they're excellent. They think they give more than they take. They believe they show up more often than others do. But if you ask their friends the same question, the answers don't always match. The gap between self-perception and outside perception becomes clear. Illusory superiority shows up in the workplace. Employees often believe they're more productive, more creative, or more committed than their coworkers. They notice their own long hours, their own ideas, and their own improvements. They don't see what others do behind the scenes. They fill in the blanks with assumptions. They think, no one else works as hard as I do, even if it isn't true. The bias also shows up in everyday skills. Ask people if they're better than average at managing money, cooking, staying fit, or giving advice. Most say yes. It doesn't matter what the skill is. The answers tilt high. It's not that people think they're perfect. They just think they're better than most. The average becomes a low bar in their mind. Driving is one of the clearest examples. Almost everyone thinks they're a better than average driver. They believe they're more alert, more courteous, and more skilled than other drivers. Even people with a history of accidents or tickets often say they're good drivers who had bad luck. They blame conditions or other people. Their self-image stays intact. This bias doesn't always come from ego. Sometimes it comes from blind spots. You know your own intentions. You know how much effort you put in, but you don't see what others are doing. That lack of visibility creates space for assumptions. You fill that space with the version of yourself that feels accurate. If you rarely get feedback, that version goes untested. There's also a memory problem. You remember your successes more clearly than your failures. You tell stories where you solved the problem, made the right call, or helped someone else. Those moments stand out. The small errors, the missed chances, and the help you received from others don't always get the same attention. That uneven record leads to an uneven judgment. This bias can shape how people respond to advice. Someone gives you feedback, and your first thought is, they don't understand. You assume you're already doing fine. You think your approach is the right one. Even when the feedback is clear, you may brush it off. The bias acts like a shield. It protects your self-image, but it slows your growth. Illusory superiority also shapes how people judge others. You see someone make a mistake and assume it reflects who they are. You make a mistake and call it an exception. You say, I was tired, or that wasn't typical. You give yourself context, but you don't always give it to others. That gap makes your own performance seem better by comparison. This effect plays out in group projects. Everyone remembers what they contributed. They know the hours they spent, the pieces they fixed, and the parts they carried. But they don't see the same level of detail in others' work. When the project ends, each person may believe they did more than their share. That belief can lead to conflict, even when the work was balanced. In leadership, this bias can be risky. A manager might believe they communicate clearly, make good decisions, and support their team well. But if the team sees it differently, the gap creates problems. The manager may assume everything is working fine and miss signs that people are frustrated or confused. Illusory superiority blocks feedback and inflates self-trust. Even when people admit weakness, they often do it in a way that still protects their image. Someone might say, I procrastinate sometimes, but I work best under pressure. They admit a flaw, then flip it into a strength. This lets them keep feeling superior without confronting the cost of the habit. The bias isn't gone, it's just been reframed. The effect can also hurt decision-making. People who believe they're better than others take more risks. They assume they'll spot problems faster, avoid common errors, or recover more quickly. That confidence leads them to skip preparation or ignore warnings. When things go wrong, they're surprised. They thought their skill would keep them safe. This bias can be hard to correct because it feels so natural. You don't walk around saying, I'm the best. You just quietly assume you're not the problem. If someone cuts you off in traffic, they're reckless. If you cut someone off, you had a reason. You stay the hero of your own story. To push back against illusory superiority, you sit through a long meeting. It lasts over 2 hours. The first part is slow, the middle drags, and most of it feels like filler. Then, near the end, someone shares a clear summary and a useful next step. When the meeting ends, you think it wasn't that bad. You don't remember the full stretch of time. You remember how it felt at the end and whether something meaningful happened. That's duration neglect. It's the tendency to overlook how long an experience lasts and focus instead on the quality of a few key moments. The brain doesn't track time like a stopwatch. It compresses memory and keeps what stands out. If something was long but ended well or had a strong moment in the middle, it feels better than it actually was. If it ended poorly, even a short event can feel like a bad experience. This shows up in everyday life. You wait in line for what feels like forever. Nothing happens. No one explains the delay. Then, right before it's your turn, an employee apologizes and helps you quickly. You walk away feeling fine. You don't complain about the long wait. You don't remember the exact number of minutes. You remember how you were treated and how it ended. Researchers tested this with pain. Participants were asked to place their hand in freezing water for a set time. In one trial, the hand stayed in the cold for 60 seconds. In another, it stayed for 60 seconds, followed by 30 more seconds, where the water was still cold but slightly warmer. That second trial lasted longer and involved more discomfort overall. But when asked which experience they'd repeat, many chose the longer one. It ended better. They didn't judge the full timeline. They judged the memory of it, and the memory depended on how it ended. This applies to positive experiences too. You go to a concert, it's over 2 hours long. Some songs miss the mark. The sound system cuts out for part of the show, but the last song is perfect, and the crowd sings along. That final moment stays with you. The mistakes fade, you remember it as a great night. You don't say, it was fun for exactly 30 minutes. You just say it was fun. You see this in vacations. A trip might include long travel days, delays, and downtime. But if one hike, one meal, or one sunset felt meaningful, and if the trip ended on a good note, it becomes a good memory. The days you spent waiting at airports or walking through crowds don't get the same weight. They happened, but they don't shape the memory in the same way. Duration neglect also shows up in how we judge movies or books. A story might be slow for most of its length, but if it delivers a strong ending, we call it good. The middle parts shrink in memory. We forget how long it took to build momentum. We remember the ending and let that color the rest. This effect influences how we handle discomfort. You might think of a tough workout. It lasted over an hour, and most of it was hard. But at the end, you felt clear-headed and accomplished. That feeling overshadows the fatigue and the strain. The length of the pain doesn't count as much as how it ended. That's why people return to tough routines. The memory isn't shaped by how long the struggle lasted. It's shaped by the reward at the end. It happens in conversations too. A long talk with someone might have quiet moments, misunderstandings, or pauses. But if the last part is honest or kind or funny, the whole conversation feels good. You leave with a positive impression. You don't remember how long it was. You remember the feeling when it ended. In healthcare, this bias matters. A medical procedure might be painful or stressful. If the final steps go smoothly, or if the recovery ends with good news, patients tend to view the experience more positively. They don't recall the exact length of discomfort. They recall the emotional tone at the end. This has led to changes in how care is delivered, focusing not just on reducing pain, but on ending visits in a way that leaves the patient feeling supported. You can see duration neglect in education. A class might feel long and repetitive for most of the semester, but if the final project feels rewarding, or if the teacher closes with a strong message, the course gets a better review. The full timeline becomes a blur. The peak moment and the ending shape how students recall the experience. This bias affects how we remember difficult periods of life. A rough year might have included long stretches of stress or struggle. But if something hopeful or joyful happened toward the end, like reconnecting with a friend or reaching a goal, those final weeks can tilt the whole memory. You don't forget the hard times, but they shrink. The story gets told from the ending backward. This also plays out in arguments. A disagreement can last hours. Voices get raised, emotions run high. But if it ends in a calm apology or mutual understanding, the argument often feels resolved. The time spent arguing doesn't matter as much. The closing moment rewrites the narrative. The memory softens. People say, "I'm glad we talked," even if the middle of the conversation was tense. Duration neglect isn't always helpful. It can lead people to repeat long experiences that were mostly unpleasant because the end felt okay. A vacation that was tiring, expensive, and full of problems can still be remembered fondly if the last night was relaxing. That memory might lead someone to book the same trip again, forgetting how much of it didn't go well. It also explains why people stay too long in bad situations. A job might be dull and draining for years, but one promotion or praise at the end of the year can shift how it feels. The memory of the reward covers up the duration of the dissatisfaction. People stay because the ending seems to promise something better, even if the timeline says otherwise. This effect shapes how we tell stories. When you share a memory, you skip the boring parts. You tell the high point and how it ended. You leave out the filler. The story isn't false, but it's not the whole thing. It's compressed. The parts that last in your mind are the ones that had weight. People also judge relationships this way. A friendship or romance may have dragged on past its prime. It may have had long periods of